the sound of thunder. Taurian banners raised high asunder. Steel on steel, you hear the echoes roar. Good times rhymes with war crimes evermore. Get off our lawn, Starling scum, we stand as one. You'd better run, paws of fury, hearts ablaze. War pugs thunder through the haze. From dusty plains to the jagged peaks, we guard our home through fire and sleet. No concordant will kneel or bow. Our cause is just, our time is now. Get off our lawn, Starling scum, we stand as one. You'd better run, paws of fury, hearts ablaze. War pugs thunder through the haze. We're snarling thunder, relentless charge. Our anthem shakes the void at large. Bulldogs of justice, sharp and bold. Our legacies forged in myths untold. We howl for freedom, we rage for peace. Our battle cries will never cease. The war pugs rise, unstoppable tide. Together we conquer, side by side. Get off our lawn, Starling scum, we stand as one. You'd better run, paws of fury, hearts ablaze. War pugs thunder through the haze. Woo! Thunder haze.
War pugs. All right. Guys, I had really been hoping that I'd be able to stream on Sunday or Saturday or something like that. That did not happen. There's a myriad of reasons behind that. Like a myriad of reasons. I was really hoping. I had even tried to set up something with Sven. Sven was actually looking forward to be able to, check out the stream, but then I just couldn't even get anything scheduled. I just could not get anything scheduled. And it sucks, but it's one of those things that happen. The hospitaler is not here. Things happened. It's just, I really, really wanted to put that together, but that just means I'm going to have to do something this weekend. I'm just saying. You just watched the new animated trailer for the new Predator movie series. They're going to be streaming on Hulu. It looks like complete ass. The graphics are from a PS1 video game. Yeah, this is not surprising. Mad Mergen, the jaw is doing fine. I haven't had a chance to go to a dentist to get everything evaluated yet to see how things are looking. But I'm going to lose the tooth. I can already tell. It's just the way that it is. It is what it is. Black Wolf, the day has been going okay. I am a tired panda. It is just, whew. I'm hoping for that too, Lee. I'm really hoping for that. But today we have quite the event after Canari's. Like, it was actually, oof. Everybody gets up in arms when you start doing things a certain kind of way, and they did them a certain kind of way, okay? It was bad. It was very bad. The war got taken out of the hands of a, ruthless strategist and got handed off to the command of a sociopath. And it went exactly as you would expect. It went exactly as you would expect. It will become a war cry. It really, really would become a war cry. The first was Hell on Earth. The second was the final nail. And to be honest, the leaders of the houses need to stop getting on buses to go to the front line. It's not a place that you go for a normal tour or anything like that. Moreau went out the way he wanted. It's not a tour, man. You're in a battle. I understand that you want. It's not a bring in the kids moment either. Especially not for Marik. Marik has lost. So, this is the most, it's almost at this point, Marik has lost so many successors. It's not even fun anymore. Oh, I don't doubt it, Andrew. I don't doubt it, because I haven't seen the leaders of the houses do anything that makes absolute tactical sense in quite some time. Valnera, I don't want to hear about anything honorable coming out of Bushido. It's in terms of Battletech after what they just did. The second is if World War II went to 1920. I mean, World War I went to 1920. Oh, that's actually bad. Logical choice was made, hire mercs not die on front lines. Well, they didn't do that either. Remember when I joked, don't let Kurita near Nanking? We all knew it was coming. I just was sitting there looking at the planet like, not there. Let's not do there. That's a lot of implications. That's a lot of problems. Guys, we're going to get started. It's immediately after Kurita did what they did to Centauri's. Congratulations. You played yourself. And there is no way for you to sit there and say, oh, we're not the baddies at this point. Yes, you are the baddies. Kurita does some heinous things pertaining to mercs after the First War. Dude, Kurita's been doing heinous things all along. Now, granted, none of the houses have been doing anything that makes sense. Okay, I'll just say, Kurita was doing things that made sense up until the point where their first person, they were making the most sense. Even though I didn't appreciate their tactics, they were doing things that made the most sense. Everyone else, though, let's see here. Steiner is attempting to open up a new front with the Periphery, trying to force them into compliance, which doesn't make any sense. The Free Worlds League nuked its own planet. What are you doing? The House Liao is being House Liao, and the Free Worlds League looked at the Cretan advance into their territory and was like, you know what would be great? Let's weaken the other front that the Cretans are fighting on by attacking the Steiners. That move itself just hurt my head. Every time you play a Battletech game, you go out of your way to piss Guerrilla and the Capellans off. It doesn't surprise me. If you had reunification officer corps, this war would have been better waged. I don't know. The reunification war officer corps wasn't exactly anything to be impressed by. I mean, they had a guy who attained the moniker of the baby killer, and he was having a rough time putting down a section of worlds that didn't even have a functioning navy. Like, we were taken to decimation. We were taken to decimation. War pugs. And phone company shenanigans? Yeah, phone company shenanigans are beginning to occur. War pugs, let's get into this. We are wrapping up the first Secession War tonight. Let's go. We don't like this. The Amish are rising. Yes, Andrew. New blood.
Barbara Liao's sudden and unexpected death left a gaping void in the Capellan Confederation government. Both of her sons had been killed during the Colorway debacle, leaving only her granddaughter Ilsa in the direct line of succession. Normally, after the death of a chancellor, the commonalty prefects would meet on Cyan to confirm the heir as their new head of state. There was no talk of usurping House Liao, but Ilsa, not even yet a teenager, was clearly too young to rule. The decision was made to elect the Duke of Sidious, Sandor Quinn, as Chancellor Regent until Ilsa reached her majority.
Okay.
While Quinn's campaign against the Chesterton Worlds had won him popular support, as the prefect of the Tikhonov commonalty, his interests lay solely in that region of space. The counteroffensives Barbara and the Strategios had been planning against the Free Worlds League fell by the wayside, as the Chancellor Regent focused on his ongoing battle against House Davian.
Why?
With CCAF reinforcements arriving in...
I just don't understand, man. The Free Worlds League is currently kicking down your door, and now you're going to go out into the backyard and yell at the other people who aren't beating the hell out of you currently, and just start yelling at them that you're going to call the cops if they don't turn down the music. That's dumb. It's just, these commanders and leaders are just stupid.
In April, to secure the captured systems, the Liao Lancers were dispatched.
Christian, thank you, bud. A good quote from Barbara Liao. It's not that we love war, we're tired of peace. Hope the dentist visit will go well. I'm hoping it will too. I already know what's going to happen with this. It's going to be, it's not going to be fun. Thank you, Christian. Thank you, 12th Floor leaders. I've been keeping up on your previous live streams with the first Secession War, and you're looking when the Fed sons decide to attack the Lyrans is priceless. Yep. And I'm waking up at night thinking about that. I just sit up in bed at night just looking at the wall going, why would they attack the damned Lyran Commonwealth? It makes no sense. The likelihood of me making a 5-ish minute lore increases on the daily about this whole situation, because when you display such blatant incompetence, when you display such absolute blatant incompetence and neglect and stupidity at that, to the point where I am making comparisons between you and Herman von Straub, you have really gone above and beyond the Call of Duty when it comes to the fucking dumbass department. It is insane. 12th World Leaders, thank you, bud. Thank you, Christian. But you have literally broken new ground, okay? It is so stupid.
Conquered the last Fed Sons holdouts on the path to Terra, the former hegemony planets of Kaf and Den of Katos. The Spinwood attack group moved on to Sanilac, taking the world 2 months later.
And now you've just given yourself a front with the most aggressive house in the entire war. Good job, jackass.
Quinn's mercenaries then seized Sonia in October.
I don't even care if they
further
keep
expanding the Chesterton commonalty after a 1-month battle. Sporadic fighting continued within the Bowl and Thumb, with the Lyrans launching raids against Ilion, Marsal, and Telarska. They also moved against Kamens, the fanatic defenders, again fighting to the bitter end. the planet was finally secure come January,
There we
by
go.
which point news was filtering in from across the inner sphere. For starters, the Oberon Confederation, one of the remnants of the old Rimwell's Republic, had collapsed.
Yay.
The Lyran Intelligence Corps had been working to destabilize various warlords operating out of the ruins of the Republic, and the breakup of the Oberon worlds was their greatest coup, giving Steiner one less thing to worry about on their Periphery border.
Oh.
Reports that other remnants of the older Maris Empire had come together to form Edom's Bandits entering service with the Freewells League also reached Steiner's desk.
Oh, great.
Furthermore, word of Minoru Kurita's death reached the Archon. This was both a blessing and a curse. The Coordinator had been despised within the Commonwealth, but his son Jinjiro was by all accounts even worse.
Dude, all you have to do is show the party that he made when he got appointed the title, okay? All you have to do is just be like, hey, you want to know what we feel about this guy? Here's what he did to Centaurus.
The only saving grace was that he appeared to be fully committed to exterminating House Davian, and barely spared a thought for his Lyran neighbour. Throughout the latter half of 2796 and into the next year, the reserve units within the Draconis Combine Mustered Soldiery were busy carrying out the final orders of their deceased coordinator, Minoru. Several new commands had been raised in preparation for the assault on New Avalon, and some of these would soon see action for the first time there. To prevent any sort of encirclement from Davian troops within what was left of the Draconis March, they pushed out in a spinward direction, taking more territory in the Fairfax and Kestrel combat regions, and even moved into the Woodbine operational area adjacent to the Outworlds Alliance. No one knew it at the time, but this would be the high watermark for the entire campaign. As word of the Canari massacre began to reach the troops on the front line, they were shocked into immobility. The news from the Capellan front was equally disastrous for House Davian. Sandal Quinn continued his mercenary first, regular second strategy to take Tawas in June. That same year, the Chancellor Regent launched an audacious new offensive out of the St. Ives Commonalty, establishing 2 salients deep into the Federated Suns, even reaching as far as the New Avalon combat region. The Certis Fusiliers attempted to counterattack at Ogilvy, but were beaten back by the Chevaux Leger. By October, accounts of the Canari massacre had spread across the inner sphere. The reaction among the soldiers of the AFFS was the same as it was for civilians of their realm: disgust and fury. Not waiting for orders from the First Prince or High Command, those units stationed on Goderich lashed out at the neighbouring Logandale and Marlette.
Okay.
Davian had not successfully liberated a single world from the Dragon up to this point in the war, but whipped into a frenzy by the awful news coming from Cantari 4, they successfully pushed the demoralized DCMS off-world that November.
Huh.
The same unsanctioned attacks occurred at Bristol soon after, and then Delavan and Odell in December.
So, let me get this right. The first time the Fed Sons actually did anything worth doing in this entire damned war, they did it because they were pissed off and they didn't even listen to anybody giving them orders to do it. Box Tank, that is a very accurate statement. And it made normally good men earth-shatteringly pissed the fuck off. That is a good quote.
John Davian and his son Joshua were on nearby Ipava, making their own plans for a coordinated counteroffensive in early December. They were pleased to hear of the destruction of a pair of Draconis Combine Admiralty destroyers at Delavan, their initial target, from the spontaneous assaults of loose cannons within their armed forces. Giving tacit approval to the initiative shown by their commanders, the two hoped to support the attack and reclaim the worlds for the Federated Suns. Their fleeting hope of victory turned to ash when the First Prince and his heir were assassinated at their field base on December 9th, 27. Who hired the assassination of a pair of Draconis Combine Admiralty destroyers at Delavan, their initial target, from the spontaneous assaults of loose cannons within their armed forces. Giving tacit approval to the initiative shown by their commanders, the two hoped to support the attack and reclaim the worlds for the Federated Suns. Their fleeting hope of victory turned to ash when the first prince and his heir were assassinated at their field base on December 9th, 2797.
Do I hear 5? Do I hear 5?
Who hired the assassin remains a mystery to this day. The most obvious culprits are Jinjiro Kirita or Sandal Quinn.
Really?
But other fringe possibilities include members of the Federated Suns
Lee, not for much longer considering how long this is going.
military or government, Comstar, or even relatives within House Davian who hope to gain power themselves. Ultimately, whatever destabilizing effect their death might have been predicted to have did not come to be, as the 19-year-old Paul Davian ascended to the throne and would prove in time to be one of the realm's greatest leaders. As an aside, Jon's death also left Kenyon the Eagle as the last of the Star League era successor lords.
And boy, isn't he smug about it.
2798 got underway with the capture of Ulaanbaatar in January by Blanford's Grenadiers, the premier unit of the Tikhonov Commonalty. Sandal Quinn himself visited the front the following month to award his troops with medals for their excellent performance and conduct during the campaign. Sandal was adamant that to have any hope of winning the support of the lost Chesterton worlds, his troops mustn't use weapons of mass destruction. Later,
yeah, let's not piss off the Federated Suns any more than they already appear to be pissed off, because the reason we took this world so easily was because they seemed to be having a rage-induced seizure when we arrived. Can you America rely less than them all? Jerk? Yes, Christian.
that year, his army would capture the planets Everett and Goshen, and even dared to seize Shadar from the Draconis Combine.
Oh, that's a good idea.
The Chancellor Regent's reserved, even gentlemanly conduct was very out of character for the First Succession War, perhaps only mirrored by Hasseldorf's Boland campaign. On that front, Lyran troops landed on Talarska in March, reclaiming the world after a 3-month battle. Elsewhere on the front, Paul Steiner continued his ineffectual raiding campaign along the rest of the Commonwealth's borders.
Okay.
After becoming First Prince, Paul Davian immediately went about strengthening his position at home.
Red-Eye, who would I choose to side with? I'd side with the Taurians, because it seems like the Taurians took one look at this and were like, yeah, they're all morons. I'm leaving this. I'm not touching this with a barge pole. Just not doing this with a barge. I'm just waiting for somebody to attack the Taurians at this point for no reason. No, I wouldn't go with Canopus, because it's like at this point, everybody is acting like an abject moron.
Over the course of a 3-year period known as the Reformation, he would transform the way the Federated Suns was governed.
Ooh.
In the era of the Star League, whenever the First Lord had visited the Davian capital, he had been granted several honorary powers under the title of Duke of New Avalon.
Okay.
When Paul's grandfather John had proclaimed himself the new First Lord at the onset of the Succession Wars, he had also unwittingly assumed that same ducal position. Paul was the first to see just how significant that could be in the governance of his realm. The first power it gave him was the right to call or dismiss any meeting of the High Council, as well as speak first at those meetings. While these abilities were largely meaningless to a Cameron ruler who might only make a couple of visits in their lifetime, it was an enormous boon to the Davian First Prince. He had effectively gained the ability to completely circumvent his own government and rule as an absolute monarch should he choose.
Oh.
House Cameron had also been given dominion over 30 backwater systems. In exchange for lending the funds to develop the fledgling colonies, they would become his personal holdings for a short period until they were self-sufficient and exchanged for a new batch. When the relationship between the two families cooled after the Second Hidden War, the practice largely died off, during which time some of these planets became economic powerhouses. They were now part of Paul Davian's personal fief. Coupled with his right as First Prince to grant knighthoods and landholds, he could partition out or sell off these wealthy provinces to secure whatever funding or support he needed.
Uh-huh.
Meanwhile, the impromptu raids continued along the front. Between February and October, the AFFS succeeded in driving the Curitans off Arcadia, Coloma, Saginaw, and Strawn. With their loss, the Draconis Combine could no longer reach New Avalon in just a single jump.
Right.
Paul was quick to congratulate his military on their success, winning support among their ranks. He urged them to treat any POWs with respect, a move that, coupled with the collapsing morale among the ranks of the mustered soldiery, led many units to surrender without a fight. Disappointed in the performance of the Department of Military Intelligence, Paul Davian demanded that any information gathered from defecting Curitans be sent back to him personally.
Okay.
He used this wealth of intel to establish a new civilian intelligence agency,
Okay.
the Ministry of Information, Intelligence and Operations. With Paul
Milo. I like it.
offering generous rewards and even land grants, the MIIO quickly established itself as one of the most efficient spy networks within the Inner Sphere, returning Davian's investment tenfold.
Red Eye, at this point, if you're the Cretans, you just, open the hatch and pee on somebody. Because you can't really do anything else. The Pinkertons? Yes, Andrew.
Within the Draconis Combine, one of the Star League's most famous units was having a crisis of conscience.
Uh-huh.
The Eridani Light Horse had remained behind when Alexander Kerensky led the SLDF into exile, maintaining a watchful vigil from their home base on Trondheim. When word of the Canari massacre reached them, Ezra Bradley and his other colonels could no longer sit idle as the Inner Sphere collapsed into chaos around them.
Oh boy.
On June 5th, Bradley declared that they would be leaving the Combine and taking up service as mercenaries within the Free Worlds League. The coordinator had been courting the Eridani Light Horse for years, even before Kerensky's exodus. To lose them now would have been a major blow. Col de Giro, the planetary administrator for Sendai, home of the 151st Light Horse, suspected that Jinjiro Kirita would see him killed if he allowed them to depart, and so took drastic action to prevent that from happening. On the 13th of June, he took the families of the 50th Heavy Cavalry and 8th Recon Battalions hostage, just as they were preparing to lift off.
This is not a good idea.
He gave the units 72 hours to return, or else he would execute his prisoners.
This is a bad idea.
On the 16th, with the Eridani Light Horse still heading for the jump point, he went through with his threat. In a fit of rage, the battalion commanders went against orders and returned to Sendai. Over the course of a week, they devastated any and all Combine soldiers they came across, and ruined several cities in the bargain. Those responsible were either killed outright or captured, only to face a firing squad soon after, including Col de Giro. Comstar further cemented their reputation as saviors among the common people by helping to evacuate 12,000 civilians during the battle. With vengeance extracted, the Eridani Light Horse resumed their journey towards the Free Worlds League.
I thought they would have gone. Okay.
The unbridled attacks undertaken by Davian troops in the immediate aftermath of the Canari massacre tapered off in 2799 as supplies began to run out.
Okay.
Increasingly, the raiders were returning after a defeat, though Paul was sure to prioritize his most successful units for resupply first. In the last 2 months of 2798, AFFS units acting on their own initiative made landfall on Bremond and Tancredi, driving the Combine off early in the new year, just as others moved to reclaim Fairfax in March.
Tancredi, I remember
The
that
regional
name.
capital was successfully liberated after a grueling 6-month battle.
There we go.
Meanwhile, the garrison on Chesterton were busy preparing for the worst, fortifying their positions and building up stores to outlast a siege. They were quite surprised when the first Liao ships appeared in the system carrying not an invasion force, but emissaries from the Chancellor Regent. Sandor Quinn had them effectively surrounded. Though he had the necessary forces to take the planet, it would be an enormously costly battle for both sides, not to mention the planet itself. Sandal was prepared to accept their surrender on generous terms.
I don't think you're gonna get it, my guy. Tarleton, thanks, bud. Welcome to the Commissars. Seth, massively appreciated, bud. Hey, old man, hope you're doing well. Get yourself a pizza on me. I'm on keto no carb, my guy. The hospitaler is not here. I most certainly can't have a pizza now, Seth, can I? This is not gonna go well. Thank you, Seth. Thank you, Tarleton. This is not gonna go well. I just know this is not gonna go well.
The Davian commander, uncowed by the threat of his imminent destruction, made his position clear. If the Seacath landed on Chesterton, he would unleash his full arsenal of WMDs in mutually assured destruction.
Of course.
Not willing to render such a symbolic prize inhospitable, Quinn instead ordered his forces to maintain a blockade. Taking little interest in events around Chesterton, or any military affairs for that matter, was Ilsa Liao. The only brief action she saw was a 2-month service with the Red Lancers on Marik. Privately, this suited Quinn just fine. While a loyal supporter of House Liao, he was quite content to be a wartime leader, commanding his forces from the front, while his teenage wards built up a power base of her own among the nobility back on Cyan.
Alright.
The Duke of Sirius had become, and would likely remain, the de facto head of the Capellan Confederation armed forces long after Ilsa had taken over as head of state. Throughout his term in
Why do I feel like that's going to shift rapidly?
office, the Chancellor Regent had used his commonality's enormous industrial output to expand the armed forces considerably. The number of units under his command peaked in 2799, with the creation of 9 new regiments, split between several brigades. Additionally, the Confederation hired the services of Narhal's raiders, veterans of the Starleaf Civil War from both sides of the conflict.
Huh. Well, at least they're getting along now. Christian, thank you, bud. Battletech's response to the smug Eldar will be a one-finger salute with the sun. They have somebody equally as smug. Just set the Free Worlds League on them.
Unfortunately for Quinn, the AWFS
They nuked themselves while looking
to starve
smug.
Chesterton of support when an unsanctioned attack on Sanilac became the first battle to liberate one of the Capellan gains during the First Succession War. 2799 was the year when Commandant General Hasseldorf's Bolan campaign finally ran out of steam. After taking Marsal earlier in the year, the conquest of Ilion could only go ahead with additional support from mercenaries.
He hasn't done bad, though. Like, we can say that. Like, Lee Jonah Jameson has not done bad at all. He's taken quite a few worlds there. Tarleton, snitches get stitches when the old guys get pizza pies. Dude, why is everybody just delivering banger rhymes tonight? I'm liking it. Why is everybody doing that tonight? That is awesome. I appreciate that, Tarleton. God. Yes. Yeah, surprisingly competent for Steiner. Well, he isn't. Okay, so look. The Steiners kind of had, like, the Steiners, originally I was saying the Free Worlds League was in the best geopolitical position, okay? Originally, I was saying the Free Worlds League was in the best geopolitical position. That's kind of shifted to being the Steiners. If they would stop trying to piss everybody off. The Steiners are dealing with Caretans who are not exactly able to do that much to them because now they have a very pissed off Free Worlds League down there. And the Steiners, well, not Free Worlds League, sorry, Federated Sons. And they have the Free Worlds League, who is currently engaged in beating the brakes off the Capellans, who are currently engaged in trying to fight the Federated Sons for some reason. So the Steiners are in the best position right now. They're not doing that much with it, though. I'm just saying. Let's get into it.
Even still, it bogged down so badly that his commanders were forced to use tactical warheads to win the day, at the cost of both his mercs and the viability of the planet. In the last few years, the Lyrans had also taken a pair of systems closer to Terra. Thaddeus Marik set about reconquering the first of these in 2799.
No, Steiners aren't doing well.
His attack on Alula Australis was so swift.
Which really surprises me because the Steiners, considering how they were founded, they should be doing the best of all right now, and they're just not.
Swift that the defending mercenaries did not have a chance to escape off-world when the Marik arrived with overwhelming force. To protect the region from further Steiner aggression, another new province was formed, the Border Protectorate. They adopted the stranded mercenaries as their provincial forces, the
Okay.
Steel Guards, and later incorporated the existing Iron Guards as their own too.
Okay.
The Draconis Combine had continued to chip away at the Lyran Commonwealth in what had become a secondary front for both parties. The most significant event to occur happened in November 2799,
War
when
crime?
the field command post on Lamar, the general of the armies Paul Steiner, was hit by a nuclear strike. Publicly, the Archon was greatly angered by the death of his uncle, but privately he might have thanked the Curetans responsible. Unfortunately, Richard didn't have many better officers to replace him, turning to the underwhelming Amanda Lestrade to take over command of the LCAF.
Underwhelming.
She
Nice.
was able to win back 3 of the worlds the Dragon had taken in the last few years, but otherwise scaled back her predecessor's raiding campaign. Her only notable achievement in the following years was a raid on the industrial New Oslo, which destroyed the Razelhague regulars in garrison. Things started to turn against the Capellan Confederation at the turn of the century.
Oh, okay.
As the Draconis Combine had advanced, and the two nations had seized large chunks of the Terran hegemony, they developed a shared border. Minoru Kurita had rejected Barbara Liao's proposal for an alliance, but the two had not directly engaged each other beyond light probing raids until Sandal Quinn moved on Shadar. The DCMS now hit back at Ronald, securing the planet for the Dragon after a short 1-month campaign. For the second time in the war, the Ariana Grenadiers were virtually wiped out.
Nice.
Another wild AFFS strike landed on Tawas in July, liberating the planet in September, just as the Dieron regulars made another strike at Rio. This time at least, the Capellans were able to push them back a month later. After taking over as General of the Armies, Amanda Lestrade set about making her mark on the Lyran Commonwealth Armed Forces.
Oh, God.
To take some of the initiative back, she brought the stealths over to the Curitan front, and also hired another mercenary regiment for deep strikes. One of her
Freeman's
first
Fanatics.
changes was to broaden the list of viable targets for raids to include civilian life support structures, such as water purifiers, weather stabilizers, and atmospheric processors.
Well, if you're the last one doing it, then fine. You know, I guess. But if you're the last one doing it, I mean, what the hell?
The LIC was quick to create propaganda that included examples of enemy strikes at similar infrastructure within the Commonwealth to wipe.
Christian, it would be the war pugs. We would have a pug face biting a dragon at this point because the Cretans are dicks.
Wash the extreme tactic. In November, word reached the Archon of a shocking revelation. Duke Graham Kelswar and his Tamar Tigers had survived the botched raid on Benjamin and had spent the last 6 years conducting a guerrilla campaign out of the mountains. An investigation revealed that early unsubstantiated reports had been covered up by Paul Steiner, possibly as a means to prevent his rival's return to the Commonwealth.
Yes, I do know about the direwolves. I am checking something right now. I actually recorded something about it. I'm checking up on it to see if, they're going to be pissed off about it. If I, post a video about it, I'm just checking on it. But it's probably going to be, they're probably knee deep in media requests right now. There's actually 3 direwolves currently walking the planet right now. Romulus, Remus, and a young female Khaleesi. Because we all knew that the second that they brought back direwolves, somebody had been watching Game of Thrones way too much. So there's 3 direwolves walking the planet right now. If you did not know, they brought them back from extinction. Romulus, Remus, and Khaleesi.
Unfortunately, the Archon could not in good reason order a rescue operation that stood such little chance of success. The news reached them just 2 months before.
Okay, hold on, because I gotta do this now. I really gotta do this now. Because, frankly, I am just done by this. Hold on. I want you to listen to this and tell me what you think. Listen to this. Look at this. These are direwolves. These two direwolves that are shown to be puppies here are actually 6 months old. They are 6 months old, and this is the first time. If you don't know, this is a sound that hasn't been heard on the planet in 13,000 years. Listen. There you go. There you go. There you go. Yes. Yes. How Stark has been called. Kenneth, if Jinx from League of Legends was given a mech that fits her, it would launch nukes. It wouldn't matter which side she was dropped on.
Before the Tamar Hussars made their final stand, infiltrating the capital city and partnering with several criminal elements
MN01,
the last
Cretan,
company of the Tigers were able to hold off repeated attempts
Cretans
to
have
root
been
them
the
out
best
for
ones so
almost a
far.
week. By
The Cretans were the best ones so far until their leader got sniped, and now they're going to hell.
battle's end, the city was in ruins, and a full regiment of the DCMS had been destroyed.
Woo, son.
Ilse Liao's 18th birthday was fast approaching as
Happy
2801 began.
birthday.
Some have suggested that the
Pretty
Chancellor
much,
Regent
Captain.
considered fighting to retain his office, but such a move would never have had the support of the Capellan government. Instead, he made preparations for the handover. The troops within the two salients pushing out of St. Ives were recalled and the worlds given back to Davian.
Then why did you take them to begin with? Why did you take the planets to begin with? If you were going to do that, if you weren't going to hold them, why would you turn around and give them back to the Free Worlds League, considering what's going on? You ass.
Elsewhere,
In a position of Red Hawk, they're not. This is okay. So if they turn around and say like a thing of non-aggression with the Free Worlds League, that big, not the Free Worlds League, but the Federated Suns, that would make sense to me. Perfect sense, complete sense. I'm all for it because that's actually a good idea. You show them that you're a threat, and then you turn around and be like, "Hey, look, we're going to give you these worlds back, but we got other things we need to focus on. You got other things you need to focus on. Let's just go focus on other things." That would make sense. But I have yet to find a single person so far in this entire damn thing that is doing things that make sense to me. Except for the Cretan that just got sniped.
the CCAF was ordered to hunker down while the transition occurred. On April 19th, Sandal Quinn stepped down to become Strategic Military Advisor, while Ilse Liao took up the reins as Chancellor, leading the Capellan Confederation
Christian, no
into
kidding.
a new era.
Here we go. And the beat goes on. The beat goes on. It's getting bigger. Politics at play.
First Prince Paul Davian had spent the initial 3 years of his reign overhauling his government, his military, and his intelligence networks. The Reformation, as this turbulent time had become known, came to an end in February 2801, after which Davian began making preparations for a serious counteroffensive against the rampaging Draconis Combine.
Okay.
The resurgent armed forces of the Federated Suns had already won a number of minor victories through random strikes along the front, but Paul developed a more cohesive strategy for them to follow. While he would take to the field to inspire his soldiers to greater heroism, command of the actual ground operations mostly fell to his uncle, Thomas Holder Davian. That February, the AFFS left Logandale and headed for their first target, Canari 4.
Oh boy.
With them were the 7th Crucis Lancers, who sought to avenge the massacre that had happened on their watch.
Oh boy.
When they arrived, they found the DCMS garrison in disarray. For the past 4 years, a small guerrilla force left behind during the initial evacuation had been making their lives hell. The arrival of several Davian regiments promptly ended the fighting that April.
Centaurus is back under Federated Sun's hands. Thank you, Lee. Something to put on the back burner is Big Red's Taurian Concordant vid. Sven voices Ian Cameron's Pollock's proclamation. Oh. Okay. It's something I've got to put on. I got to get in contact with Big Red. Gear Stark, thank you, bud. It's the first succession war. Nothing makes sense, and it gets worse in the second. Perfect.
Claiming such a symbolic weld did wonders for Paul's reputation within
Gear.
the Fed Sons. To reward his efforts, the First Prince elevated Colonel Alexander Dressari to the position of Duke of Canari.
Ooh.
On the opposite side of the Ionosphere, the LCAF were again intensifying their raids within the Bolan Thumb, and seized the relatively undefended Hertzberg system in July. The mood along the Kiritan Theatre was decidedly less hopeful, as the Dragon had claimed another 4 systems, and destroyed one of their regiments in the process. The Combine could not celebrate these victories, as the AFFS continued to roll forward throughout the year. Even before Canari fell, Davian forces moved on to secondary targets in March. The last was secured in November, but by this point another wave had been launched the previous month. Another 6 of their conquests were liberated by year's end. 2802 followed more or less the same pattern. Each victory boosted the morale of the AFFS and damaged that of the DCMS. Jinjiro Kirita resorted to ever more brutal disciplinary actions on his failing commands, but this only cemented their unwillingness to fight. Many officers were so ashamed by how easily they were defeated that they chose to commit seppuku. Those that didn't were interrogated by their captors. Reports from the front were now flowing smoothly back to the Davian intelligence agencies, providing them with further information on Kiritan deployments. This allowed their scarce naval assets to isolate the worlds with the heaviest garrisons and strike where the line was weakest.
Nice.
Another 6 worlds were liberated in 2802, and they were making landfall on 4 more by year's end. The Woodbine operational area was now totally back under their control. The Draconis Combine was also suffering attacks from the Capellan Confederation. Ronald was apprised that Liao did not wish to give up so easily, and made several attempts to reclaim it during the first 5 years of the 29th century. They were somewhat troubled to find that elements of the Ariana Grenadiers left behind after their initial loss had come together to form a mercenary battalion fighting for Kirita.
Bad dream.
The Combine struck back by launching an attack on Lincoln. Elements of the Northwind Highlanders on Weld were still recuperating from repelling a Marik assault on Zion, a battle that saw them destroy rival mercenary regiment Gladstone's Gladiators. Seeing off Damien's destroyers and their regular support proved a greater challenge, one that continued into the new year. In 2802, the Lyrans reclaimed 2 of the systems lost to House Marik during the first years of the war.
The thumb is vanishing.
Both had been heavily scarred by the use of WMDs during the initial invasion. With their loss, the Free World's foothold within the Illyrian province became extremely tenuous. 2802 was also a landmark year for Comstar. In March, they announced that for the first time, the organization was no longer in the red. Jerome Blake's decision to chase profits had come at
the Amish have embraced extreme forms of capitalism.
the expense of several systems, however. Comstar had prioritized whatever worlds were most likely to bring in revenue, either through their population or their strategic position. Several systems within the former hegemony had been largely abandoned, unable to call in aid or supplies. The Periphery especially, whom Blake held personally responsible for the Stalag Civil War, was particularly hard hit. Nevertheless, approximately 40% of the Inner Sphere was now serviced by a Comstar HBG, and the number of hyperpulse generators would continue to grow even as the succession wars raged around them.
You may be seeing notices in your mailbox saying that we are expanding in your area. We want you to know that we will not abuse this power as your only long-distance provider. Pay your bills, fucko.
The Federated Suns and Lyran Commonwealth were once again the only factions making moves in 2803. The AFFS was still riding the wave, securing their winter conquests and then taking 4 more systems in the summer, before launching yet another pair of invasions by year's end.
Now remember, they were all the way down here and all the way over to here. We've got to get up to here. We got to get all the way up. Where's Breed at? There's Breed right there. We got to get there. So all of these worlds have got to get back under... Yeah, there we go.
The Lyran conquests within...
Seth! Don't be mad about your kidneys. We'll just give you a credit for future services. Don't worry, we're Comstar.
The Bowl and Thumb that year would prove to be the last of Hasseldorf's private campaign. Significant use of weapons of mass destruction on Malazan meant very few of the FWLM forces on World escaped to reinforce their compatriots on a crux. Like Roche before it, the devastation was so great that Steiner ultimately decided the colony was a lost cause, ceding the wasteland back to the League. The defenders on Finsterwalde were quick to resort to the same tactics, only this time the results were far more costly for the LCAF. When the Lyran
show up, try to conquer planet, then nuke planet into the dirt, and then... you can keep it.
Guards touched down, they were hit by successive WMD strikes, obliterating the regiment. Worse, the last of the corvettes the Commandant General had access to were hit by aerospace fighter-launched nuclear missiles.
Of course.
With no means to escort his units to their next destination, the Archon ordered Hasseldorf to call off his offensive. For his successes, he was made a Baron of Kaunberg and promoted to General.
Yay!
How Steiner formally declared a victory over the Free Worlds League and considered the Bowl and Thumb to be reclaimed by the Lyran Commonwealth.
But it's not. It's not. It's not retaken. It's just not. Christian, we know you have no choice in telecommunication providers. And that's a good thing. Praise Blake. Thank you,
The
bud.
last few Marik holdouts were in an untenable position and would surely wither on the vine. Elsewhere in the realm, the pirates known as Cameron's Curse, once Amaris regulars who had deserted their emperor as Kerensky closed on Terra, accepted a contract with House Steiner as the rebranded Raymond's Redcoats.
Okay.
Turning his attention towards his other opponent, Steiner ordered a raid against the former Terran hegemony provincial capital of Lone Star.
Seth, you don't understand. Your wife also uses Comstar. We have her kidneys as well. On
Their
loan.
primary targets were the atmospheric processors that allowed the planet to maintain a breathable atmosphere, themselves only a necessity after an earlier Kiritan bioweapon was unleashed in an effort to make the population capitulate. This led to a terminal environmental collapse.
Yay.
And with civilian jump ships now a rarity, eventually the starvation and death of tens or perhaps even hundreds of millions on world. Elsewhere in the ruins of the hegemony, a Draconis Combine salvage team arrived at the dead world of Inglesmond, tomb to more than 4 billion individuals. Despite Comstar reports that there were no survivors, they were shocked to find that one of the continents housed a large group of survivors, numbering around 1 million. Initial efforts to steal anything of value met with resistance from a battalion of mechs taken from an SLDF supply cache. As if in rejection of the native population's incredible determination to survive, the Combine again unleashed their strategic arsenal and finished what their predecessors started. One final tragedy in the planet's sad legacy.
That's not even beating a dead horse. It's like, look, there's a flower growing out of the pavement that we made after we glassed the whole fucking planet. Look at how beautiful this flower is. We should stomp on it and hit it with weed killer. Ass!
On January 19th, 2804, Captain General Kenyon Marik suffered a fatal heart attack. The free world's...
Do I hear 6? I have 5. Can I get to 6? Can I get to 6? The level of smug has finally gone down.
Parliament called a session to discuss who would become the next Captain General. While the Eagle's campaign against the Capellan Confederation had been fantastically successful, in the last decade of his life, the exhausted military had been unable to make much progress, taking
Well, get off Canopus, assholes.
only Christensen from the Tikhonov Lancers in the previous 3 years. His sole surviving descendant, Thaddeus, had proven himself unable to score many victories against the Lyran Commonwealth.
Okay.
At the time of his father's death, he was busy launching another
Natural
attack
death,
on Alhina.
MN01.
Resolution 288
MN01, you're acting like Comstar hasn't already killed people.
had given Kenyon supreme authority within the League, but his death meant the Marik family was no longer in control. Thaddeus's campaign on Alhina concluded just 3 days later, at which point he immediately departed for Atreus to stake his claim. Unfortunately, his flagship suffered a jump drive malfunction en route, stranding the Marik air at Rasselas until alternate transportation could be found.
Oh.
When he finally made it back to the capital in July, he found Parliament was ready to remove him from power.
Oh.
Thaddeus argued that because his father had never renounced Resolution 288, and since the First Succession War was still raging, the law was clearly still in effect. As his heir, he was entitled to all the powers Kenyon had wielded. The ministers were unconvinced, and 2/3 of them decided to walk out in protest, only to come face to face with a company of loyal Marik battlemechs.
Oh.
With a gun pointed to their head, most returned to their seats in order to affirm Thaddeus as Captain General.
Great.
The following month, the Grand Duke of Orient Carter Allison and his allies from the Duchy of Orloff arrived on Atreus to have their say. They were vehemently opposed to the blatant political bullying and would not give Thaddeus their support. Marik had nevertheless achieved sufficient backing to become the new head of state. His first act was to withdraw the Free Worlds League military from House Allison's territory. The strong alliance that had existed between the two families since the nation's founding more than 5 centuries ago was broken. The Capellan Strategios immediately moved to take advantage of the political infighting within the League.
When the smug, it's like, that's what was fueling the Free Worlds League war machine. Just unbelievable levels of smug. And now that that smug has departed this mortal coil, has shed the mortal coil, now we enter the stupid. The Free Worlds League main sport is internal conflict, so we're oh man, we just finished the regular season. Now we're on to the playoffs. When's the Super Bowl?
Their shared border had been more or less static for over a decade by this point, but as soon as the FWLM departed, the CCAF swept in to retake 3 of their lost worlds in September. They now prepared for an assault on the provincial capital.
There we go!
Davian's counteroffensive was still going strong in 2804,
Alright, Caden.
though progress had somewhat slowed. Between February and December, they liberated only 2 more systems, moving on another pair towards the end of the year. On the other fronts, exhaustion coupled with a lack of transports meant there was very little movement.
Wow, okay.
In late December, a Capellan task force
They're all dead, MN01. They're all dead.
appeared within the Orient system and began moving towards the capital. Their objective was to spend a month on the ground, causing as much damage to the planet as they could, then withdraw before the Captain General could send in reinforcements. What little space defenses Carter Allison had left were sent into action, alongside hastily conscripted civilian dropships. Their near-suicidal actions, as well as fire from the anti-capital ship emplacements on the surface, did succeed in destroying a third of the raiders, but enough had made landfall to set ablaze several industrial sites and cities before Colonel Moretta called for a retreat off-world. At the time, the survivors of the raid believed that they had only just escaped before Marik could extract retribution, but the Mashkarovka soon realized that the only League redeployments that were taking place in the region were provincial forces moving within the Grand Duchy. The Captain General was far more interested in the Lyran Theatre, which he had been commanding since 2789. In March, he launched an attack on Bela, pushing the Donegal Guards back 2 months later. This was a key part of his strategy to draw the LCAF away from a crux, as the FWLM prepared for a breakout. Ilsa Liao was shocked at how Thaddeus had left his ally out on a limb. With seemingly no help coming to House Allison, she moved to take Fujidera in April, and liberated a pair of systems within the salient jutting into the Sana commonality, after which they prepared for a full invasion of Orient. Moretta returned to the enemy capital in June, leading many of the same units into battle. This time, they stayed well out of range of the surface emplacements, instead dispatching commando teams to bring them down so that their warships might move into firing positions overhead. Their plan quickly went awry when a blizzard developed over their intended targets, forcing the Liao colonel to rush all of his attacks. Most of the nuclear missile silos were eliminated, but it came at the cost of more than half of his aerospace fighters. With barely any air cover and visibility failing fast, any hope of victory the Capellans had deserted them when an artillery strike hit their command compound, killing Moretta. Through pure luck, Orient was given a reprieve when the invasion's second-in-command called for a withdrawal. In their anger at having failed to take the planet, the Liao corvettes made an attack run on the major cities, bombarding the world before departing back to Confederation space. Millions of Orient citizens had been killed, and Carter Allison was forced to concede defeat. The capture of Fletcher in July made it clear that the Capellans would be returning to finish the job. He departed for Atreus to humbly beg for Thaddeus's help before a third attack on his homeworld could be launched.
Lee, this is a good question. If you and your war pugs had to serve one of the four houses, Karita obviously not, who would you pick? At this point in the war, I would most certainly sign up with House Davian. I would be in their employ. I would not join the Lyrans. Davian. One, they're desperate, and two, and here's the big two, I get to beat up the Capellans and the Caritans. I mean, that's just a good thing either way. I mean, it's just good overall.
Davian's counteroffensive maintained their momentum throughout 2805, liberating 2 worlds between April and December, moving on to another 3 by the end of the year.
I'll take Kestrel. It sounds like a bird.
Among their new targets were Elbar and Cartago, 2 planets that Minoru Kirita had hit in the opening month of the invasion. This next batch of systems was secured early in the following year.
Nice.
Word of Carter Allison's flight from his Grand Duchy reached Ilsa Liao and Thaddeus Marik at the same time. Both began hurried preparations to move forces onto Orient. Predicting that the Duke surely intended to request aid, the Captain General sent a strike force from the Principality of Regulus, including units from the recently expanded Regulan Hussars, towards Fletcher and Fujidera, but diverted them when he received the news that a Capellan fleet had already arrived at Orient. After dispatching the meager defenses at
Kenneth, a
Zenith on
lot.
September 18th, the Capellans made landfall on October 6th and promptly set about securing their priority targets. The battle for the capital city began in mid-November, just as the FWLM reinforcements were arriving. The 3 largest Marik warships jumped to a pilot point in orbit above the planet, directly on top of the Liao squadron. Despite their numbers advantage, the Confederation warships were short on tonnage and still bearing scars from the prior battles over Orient.
Bye.
All but one was destroyed at the cost of just a single League cruiser. With complete orbital supremacy established, the League task force began landing on December 18th. 4 mech and 12 conventional regiments spread out across the planet's surface to secure industrial and military targets, then gathered together for the attack on the capital.
Okay.
The CCAF had dug in and were not above using tactical nukes to hold off an advance. Most of the city was ruined by the time the last survivors finally surrendered on January 7th.
Did the Free Worlds League just nuke another one of their own fucking planets? Did the Free Worlds League just nuke another one of their planets? I'm seeing some nopes, I'm seeing some yeps. The Cappies did it. Oh, the Capellans did it. I thought they lost.
The victory at Orient revitalized the weary Free Worlds League military.
No, the Free Worlds...
In March, they moved to reclaim 4 of the worlds Ilsa had taken in her path towards Orient,
Cool.
driving them off by year's end.
Cool.
Thaddeus's main focus remained the Lyran front, however, and so even before his counterattack against Liao began, he advanced on Radostov in February.
The thumb's coming back.
The goal was to find the path of least resistance to connect the regiments stranded on a crux with the rest of the realm. With only militia to defend it, Radostov belonged to Marik by May. But the League didn't have much cause to celebrate, as House Steiner had already launched a counterattack on Bela 1 month earlier. This had been one of the Captain General's main objectives in the region, so to take it from him in just 2 months, only a year after his initial victory at Bela, was a major embarrassment. But the Lyran Commonwealth too could not celebrate.
Okay.
The Draconis Combine had been picking up
that's
the Commonwealth
right.
with frequent low-level raids, identifying targets for swift invasions. In the past 5 years, they had taken Al-Nazal, Orbison, Buckminster, and Vega, the latter 2 of which would become prefecture capitals in later decades. The cycle of disappointment continued around the Innisphere, though.
I thought we were calling the cycle of disappointment the Capellan line.
They had failed to take Rio from the Capellans and continued to lose ground on their rimward flank. In the same February to May period that Marik took Radostov, the Federated Sons liberated Sholam and Corridon. With these victories, the Federated Sons finally took a 5-month break to move up reinforcements and supplies before moving again in November-December time.
I love it. This is a spaceport called. This is spaceship manufacturing, and it's called Layover. Love it.
2807 saw the final moves of the Davian counteroffensive before they at long last ran out of energy. In January, they launched an assault on the Curitan forces stationed at Evansville, Rowe, and Sun Prairie, as well as against the CCAF occupiers at Castleton. They also set about crushing the pockets of DCMS resistance in their reclaimed territory. Both sides were heavily fatigued, and the ever-decreasing number of jump ships made maintaining an offensive almost impossible. Paul Davian went so far as to issue specific orders to his naval forces not to destroy enemy jump ships unless unavoidable, a state of affairs that remains in place even today, centuries later. With the completion of these campaigns in June, a quiet settled over the Innisphere for the rest of the year.
Okay. It's not gonna last. Here we go. The grind. The grim grind.
After a brief lull in the fighting, the First Succession War once again flared up in December of 2807, when the Free Worlds League made their next step in their plan to rebuild the Bolan Thumb. Descending on Marsal were the two lead units of the Bolan Defenders, who made short work of the Lyran garrison, claiming the world as their own by February. Realizing that they could not ignore the threat still lurking within the Commonwealth, Lyran High Command redeployed to deal with the Bolan remnants. In May, they countered with an assault on Radostov, liberating the planet once again after a 2-month campaign. 2808 is the point that some historians cite as the year when the First Succession War entered its second phase. By this stage, every successor state had exhausted their strategic reserves. Most of the shipyards and many of the battle mech factories lay in ruins. Warships and jump ships were extremely scarce. Even ammunition was becoming hard to come by. Conscription was in widespread use in every realm to try and maintain operational numbers. Wave after wave of new recruits were rushed through training, and the cadets being put onto the...
Look, this is a very bad sign. This is a really bad sign for everybody involved. I mean, think about how bad it has to be. The Federated Suns is recruiting gingers. That's horrifying.
Front lines were younger and younger. One realm that was feeling the hurt from three sides was the Capellan Confederation. The Federated Suns were riding the wave of momentum that swept a path forward, but also threatened to break and turn towards the Confederation.
Yes, your little pistol's gonna hurt
Since the disaster at Orient, the Free Worlds League had reclaimed all of the worlds the CCAF had only just liberated, and then dispatched their Marik militia alongside Smithson's Chinese bandits to grab Mozero.
That's their name? Smithson's Chinese Bandits? That's great.
The best they could muster in retaliation was a raid on Nova Roma by the Chevaux Leger, and the two would battle on and off over the next 5 years for control of the planet Ibstock. Their only saving grace was that Thaddeus Marik remained much more interested in the Lyran Commonwealth than following through on his father's desire to crush House Liao. For the Chancellor, the most pressing concern was the sharp increase in action towards Terra. Their last attempt to retake Ronal in 2805 had failed. Since then, the Draconis Combine had been conducting a side campaign within the former hegemony. In time, they would take another 6 worlds from the Tikhonov commonality. It was with this threat looming that Chancellor Ilsa Liao made one of the most shocking decisions of the Succession Wars.
Okay. This better be good because damn.
In April 2808, Ilsa Liao renounced her claim to the First Lordship. Furthermore, she sent a messenger to First Prince Paul Davian and offered to back his candidacy. The condition for her support was simple: recognize Confederation ownership of the Chesterton worlds. To the ruling class of the Federated Suns, this incredible offer seemed almost too good to be true. First of all, a cessation of hostilities on the Capellan front would allow them to focus all their energies against the Draconis Combine in the upcoming second offensive Paul was planning. It came at the cost of Chesterton and its subsidiaries, but the truth of the matter was that they were almost all in Confederation hands already, and would take considerable effort to win back. But perhaps even more significant, with Davian and Liao aligned behind the First Prince, all it would take is to win the support of a party neutral to both of them, i.e. the Lyran Commonwealth, to have a voting majority among the former members of the Star League High Council. In June, the Chancellor received Paul's response. The First Prince dispatched the Crucis Lancers to take Ulaanbaatar and then Farwell 2 months later. His rejection shocked the nobility of both realms and threatened to undermine his newfound popularity at home. Pundits at the time lambasted his arrogance, but the
Give me a second, I'm processing this. It might have something to do with the fact that it's the Capellans. And I wouldn't trust me to tell a Capellan to tell me the sky was blue.
Davian Lord might have realized something that his contemporaries did not, save perhaps Ilsa Liao herself. The succession wars were and are a farce. The Star League, if it even still existed at the commencement of the hostilities, had long since faded into memory. The Terran hegemony was gone too. There were only the successor states left, and there was no higher authority that any of the House Lords would recognize anymore. Ilsa's offer to name him First Lord was hollow, an appeal only to vanity, and the price was to sacrifice systems that had belonged to the Federated Suns for over 400 years.
Yep.
As 2808 drew to a close,
Okay.
the AFFS was getting ready to launch their second counteroffensive. The goal was twofold. The primary objective was to drive the DCMS out of the Crucis March altogether, while secondary assaults took aim at the extreme flanks of the Draconis March. Troops were assembled on Castleton and Roe, launching their attack in the first 3 months of 2809. Nearby, the Crucis Lancers succeeded in capturing Farwell and Ulaanbaatar that March. The Castleton Task Force showed early success, taking the planets Johnsondale and Olancha by mid-year.
Okay.
Included on the list of targets for Davian's campaign were the worlds of Cassius and Udibi, two systems that lay within the pre-war borders of the Draconis Combine. It was the first time a concentrated effort had been made to seize Kiritan territory since the war began. Understandably, this side of the front saw much fiercer resistance compared to the liberation campaigns of the past decade, where the locals were only too happy to assist the arriving AFFS. Nevertheless, the planets were secure by year's end. Between October and December, both flanking groups were moving on to secondary targets, while a third task
M1, Davian's reasoning is sound. I mean, for her to sit there and say, okay, we'll recognize you as the first star. Good for you, but it means nothing. It's a dead title to take control of a dead power. There's no point to this shit. And Davian realized that.
Force advanced up the center, hoping to retake the capital of the Kestrel combat region.
There we go.
In an effort to finally push the Free World's military out of the Alarian province, an assault was made on the fortified stronghold of Crux in November. Going in at a numbers disadvantage was always going to be a risky gamble, and the Lyrans ultimately had to concede defeat in January. They had more success closer to the border, when they took back Alula Borealis in May 2810.
Okay.
The previous December, the Federated Suns had moved to reclaim.
If Kerensky came back right now, populations in, I'd say probably, the Lyran Commonwealth would probably side with them almost instantaneously, just to get somebody to save the rest from the Caretans. The Caretans would, of course, fight Kerensky to the death, because Caretans. The Davians would be more receptive. The Capellans, I'm not sure, but the Free Worlds League, I don't know. Yeah, Kerensky is, I don't think he's dead at this point. He's close to dead. Because there would be no way he could actually stop this. This devolved from any real semblance of a actual conflict to an outright brawl a long time ago.
In commonality.
Oh, now it's
completing
kids
the
in
liberation
charge. That's
a few
screwed.
months later. The retreating Zurich Lancers were pursued across Algot, Halloran, and Uaragon in the early part of 2810, before the AFFS focused instead on Teribert. Their effort to take the planet turned especially nasty when both sides deployed nuclear weapons.
Of course.
The major settlements on the world were caught in the blast, after which the viability of the planet collapsed.
Yay!
Fighting ended in June when both the Capellans and Davian liberators abandoned the system. The Liao Lancers had their chance at payback later that year with a raid of their own against Jaipur. The Davian counteroffensive maintained its momentum into 2810, the 3 task groups landing on 9 different worlds altogether between February and April.
We're slowly getting back to breed.
Word of the pincer attack the Fed Sons were attempting had made it to those infantry regiments guarding the center of the line. Fear of an impending encirclement and potentially harsh retributions for their actions earlier in the war caused many to desert their posts. This left the battle mech units unsupported and exposed.
Oh.
McKinnon's raiders
Seth, you have a
undertook
nice
deep
night, bud.
raids against the Combine throughout the year to keep them off balance. A lack of available transports further hampered Kurita's efforts to blunt the Davian advance.
Huh.
The second, much shorter counteroffensive concluded in December. Paul Davian had planned to take a pause here to regroup, but reports from the front suggested that the Draconis Combine mustered soldiery were finally forming a defensive line ahead. The longer he waited, the better prepared Kurita would be once the fighting resumed. He therefore hurried to move up reinforcements and supplies to begin the third counteroffensive ahead of schedule early in the new year.
Let's go.
Archon Richard Steiner had run out of patience with his ineffectual military leadership. One of the few units to achieve success for the Commonwealth had been the Stealth Mercenary Regiment. In recent years, they had helped make possible, either through direct assault or supporting raids, the capture of 2 planets within the Dieron military district.
Yay!
For that reason, the Archon made the decision to nationalize the unit in 2810.
Oh!
At great cost, he bought out the entire regiment. Colonel Hempstead was paid.
He becomes a superhero, dude. I mean, what do you want from me, Kenneth? I mean, like, seriously. It's done. I've heard it said that infantry and Battletech is considered fodder before it seems that without support, mechs are just as vulnerable. Yeah, this makes a lot of sense. And Christian, that makes a lot of sense. Izanzo, yeah, that makes a lot more sense. Now, yeah, this whole war is stupid. I'm just saying, if the clans came to the Inner Sphere during their succession war, about 90% of all the civilian population of the spheres and parts of the periphery would join the clans. Oh boy, third succession war is coming.
Paid a handsome fee to sign on with the LCAF, and given greater authority to command operations on the ground.
Okay.
As part of the deal, the Stealths were granted a period of rest and recreation, far away from the Kuritan front.
Okay.
In December, the Lyran Commonwealth made another attempt to retake Marsal. Despite a relative parity in the numbers, the Bolan defenders were able to hold their ground and force the LCAF to withdraw in the new year, handing the Archon his second defeat in successive years. In an effort to relieve the pressure on those stranded units, the Captain General decided to launch a diversionary campaign on the extreme end of the border at Poulsbo. If the attack here proved successful, Thaddeus Marik hoped to link up with the Crux from both sides, cutting off a large chunk of the Eladium province. They made landfall in early 2811, expecting minimal resistance, but they found the fully recuperated stealths and a strong aerospace presence.
The stealths just got done having a party with tons of stripper and blow. They were ready to go, okay?
A detachment of fighters swept in on the recharging jump ships and destroyed them in seconds, stranding the Atrian Dragoons on world. The Lyrans now used their complete air superiority to hunt down and wipe out the entire regiment. With his campaign on Poulsbo brought to a sudden and ignominious end in March, the Captain General reluctantly accepted the fact that the Bolan Thumb was lost. He dispatched messages to the last of the defenders, informing them of his decision. The subtext of his missive was clear. He expected them to fight to the last. While the decision
tell that guy to go pound sand. He's abandoning you.
And to move the stealths over to Poulsbo proved extremely fortuitous. Some even speculate the LIC was aware of Thaddeus's plans and the Archon's offer of R&R was a ruse. It unfortunately came at the cost of further losses on the Kuritan front. In the past few years, the Draconis Combine had taken 4 systems from the Tamar Pact, getting dangerously close to their capital. If the Federated Sons had learned anything from their near destruction, it was that the division of their perimeter marches into combat regions had contributed significantly to the way in which the DCMS had rolled over them earlier in the war.
Yeah, the Koreans are getting nibbled on one side and nibbling on the other.
Because they were cross-sections of the march, if the Curetans could capture the capital and eliminate the leadership, they had effectively cleared a path straight through to the Crucis March. It was very challenging for the neighbouring combat regions to support them, or manoeuvre forces around in front of the advance.
Okay.
For that reason, Paul Davian came up with the concept of polymorphous defence zones. The Capellan and Draconis marches would be redistricted into irregular but interlinked areas that would hopefully prevent a similar collapse in the future.
Okay.
At the conclusion of the second Davian counteroffensive, the first prince dispatched a small force to Marik in December. This would be the final strike Paul planned to make against the Capellan Confederation, as most of his energy went into preparing for the next wave of attacks against Draconis Combine.
Smart man.
In March, the planet was his, and he began the third and final counteroffensive of the war. The goal was to push the Draconis Combine all the way back to their pre-war borders and establish a new defensive line. Once again, the AWFS approached from two directions, skirting along the edge of their old border from the Spinward end, while the main advance pushed deep into the former Clovis combat region. As anticipated, the DCMS had fortified the region substantially. They no longer displayed the same shell-shocked behaviour as they had in the aftermath of the Canari massacre. They faced particularly stubborn resistance on Harrow's Sun. Regiments from the Combine interior had also been redeployed to the front. This was made possible in part through the actions of Amphigean Agriculture Incorporated,
Yay!
who in 2811 formed a security group to protect their assets and any supporting industries. Thus,
You're not Comstar. You're farmers. Buy your corn or else does not have the same ring as pay your bill or else.
freeing up the mustered soldiery and garrison to move elsewhere.
Lee, you consider Paul Davian the actual start of Davian military competence. His forefathers had plenty of encounters with Guerrilla and kept misjudging them. Yep, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Because he's making a lot of smart decisions at this point.
Early in 2811, Ilse Liao and Ameshkarovka began an audacious operation that they hoped would give them an edge over their competitors. They began to approach Comstar technicians in the hope of winning them over to the Confederation. With their expertise, they could train their own loyal workforce and move to take control of the HPGs within their realm. If successful, they could avoid paying Comstar the substantial fees they charged on all military communiques.
True, 71.
Things escalated around March-April time, when Mashkarovka agents posing as a terrorist group attempted to seize the hyperpulse station on Nanking, but remarkably, the attack was thwarted by the chief administrator and their staff, who ambushed them inside the facility. Comstar uncovered the identity of the terrorists soon after, and in May, the First Circuit agreed to form a covert security force in response, ROM. Training was to take place at the reactivated Sandhurst Military Academy, site of some of the most intense fighting during the Battle for Terra.
Oh boy.
At the Terran end of the Capellan Confederation lay the former hegemony world of Brownsville. As a system of die-hard Amaris loyalists, they had received precious little in way of support from Alexander Kerensky after his liberation, and the world had fallen on hard times. This was a hardship partly of their own making, as their fervent commitments to the Emperor had led them to detonate nuclear warheads among their own industrial centers in order to prevent them from falling into SLDF hands.
I'm sorry, when you asked Amaris for help and he told you to go fuck yourself, did you take that literally?
They had at least evacuated the complexes ahead of time, a courtesy rarely afforded by retreating AEAF forces.
Thank you, Christian. I also think that Davian and Liao are functional families, so the heirs are taught the mistakes of the previous generations. They play the long game. That actually seems to make a lot more sense, to be quite honest with you.
In one of the very few exceptions to the purge that followed the collapse of the Empire,
Thank you, Christian.
The Planetary government had retained its power, much to the consternation of people like Kerensky, and had tried for a time to maintain their independence. Witnessing the fate of Ingolsmund led them to finally submit before House Liao when they threatened a similar scouring in 2789. The decades-long process of rebuilding was finally coming to a conclusion in the early 29th century. What perhaps was not understood was that their reduced industrial output had allowed them to skirt under the radar in the earlier phase of the war. But now, with a functioning and relatively advanced industrial base, covetous neighbours were starting to look their way. In 2811, the Free Worlds League decided that the people of Brownsville would be better off under the protection of the Captain General. A force was dispatched to take control of what appeared to be a relatively undefended world. But the Brownsville militia were all veterans of the Civil War, their inexperienced younger generation siphoned off into the ranks of the CCAF.
Okay.
They put up unexpected resistance that the Marik forces could not contend with. It was a humiliation that the invaders were not prepared to leave unanswered.
Oh, good.
As they departed, a civilian freighter approached the system, going unnoticed by those on planet. As it moved into orbit, it unleashed a cargo of strategic weapons that obliterated the cities of Brownsville, killing more than 100 million civilians. The nuclear winter that followed was so severe that the death toll would reach 250 million within the next 2 years,
Dicks.
almost half of the planet's population, and that number had doubled by war's end. The few million survivors would all succumb to the planet's poisoned atmosphere within the next few decades.
Dude.
2811 saw the final battles for what was once the Bow and Thumb. Earlier in the year, 4 LCAF regiments descended on a crux for the second time. The defenders were still heavily damaged from the prior attack, and the Captain General had not been willing to resupply them. The Marik militia lifted off early on, leaving the Boland defenders to hold out as long as they could. The final holdouts were destroyed in May.
There we go.
Another 4 regiments landed on Marsal in November. Here, they faced off with the very last of the Boland defenders. Fanaticized by Marik propaganda, they gave their lives for a hopeless cause, dragging the battle out for 4 months before they fell.
Okay.
Over the winter, the Federated Suns succeeded in taking 3 more worlds from House Kurita.
There we go.
One of their targets was the planet Magihi, part of the Draconis Combine since the colony was first founded, where they destroyed the Galladan regulars in garrison. With the capture of Tishomingo, the pre-war Fairfax combat region was completely liberated. The next wave began in April, securing another 3 systems over the next 7 months, but only after fierce fighting on New Iverson. This was somewhat offset by the complete absence of the DCMS on Dobson. By this point, it was clear to Coordinator Jinjiro that Paul Davian was trying to isolate the capitals of Dahar-4 and Robinson, the command and control hubs for the mustered soldiery deployed within the occupied territory.
There we go.
2812 was a rough year for the Lyran Commonwealth. At the same
What has not been a rough year for the Lyran Commonwealth? Just due to sheer incompetence.
time as they were hunting down the last of the Boland defenders in February, the Draconis Combine attacked Coldria and Dove with an overwhelming force of light battle mechs. Moving too quickly for conventional weapons, the garrison commanders attempted to use nuclear warheads to stop them. The DCMS retaliated with chemical weapons on Dove,
Of course.
rendering the world inhospitable.
Thanks,
The
dicks.
last of the civilian population would either evacuate off-world or die within the next 3 years. Around this time, the newly formed ROM were beginning their first operations within the Capellan Confederation. Relations between the two were frayed by the attempt at seizing an HPG the previous year. Both were looking to get retribution. ROM discovered that the Mashkarovka were plotting to assassinate the chief administrator of the Bryant HPG, a member of Comstar's First Circuit.
Okay.
After foiling their plans, the first major victory for the nascent covert ops group, Ilsa Liao ordered the Mashkarovka to cease any attempts at subverting Comstar control. The Chancellor had far greater ambitions at this time. Early in the year, a diversionary attack was launched by Blanford's Grenadiers on the planet Sirius. Though they succeeded in destroying the mercenaries in garrison, they did not try to hold on to the planet.
Why?
Their objective was simply to misdirect the Federated Suns into thinking that Liao was focused on the Free World's border. A Capellan task force appeared above Chesterton in May. They faced only minimal resistance as they entered atmosphere. The 4 regiments touched down near various objectives that they hoped would finally bring the long-contested world under their control. Unfortunately for Liao, Days before they departed the Confederation, an MIO operative embedded within the Mashkarovka alerted Davian to their intended target.
You've triggered my trap card!
Giving the AFFS just enough time to relocate a few regiments of their own to the planet ahead of the invasion. They laid low until the Seacaf made landfall, striking only as they began to emerge from their dropships. Unable to form a defensive line, the Capellans took heavy damage in these opening moments. Just 3 days into the campaign, the Capellan charges had been destroyed, and 7 other battalions had been ravaged by the defending garrison. The Liao commander had no choice but to call a retreat, leaving with their tail tucked between their legs.
Huh. Nice.
Within the Lyran Commonwealth, the declining numbers of available jump ships were causing ever greater suffering on worlds that relied on those vital food shipments to survive. Several systems were in the midst of terrible famines, contributing to the abhorrent death toll of the First Succession War as much as the use of WMDs on the front lines. In June, the Speaker of the Assembly officially disbanded the Estates General on account of how few of the planetary rulers were able to make it to Tharkad. On August 3rd, the Archon was holding court when he was approached by Landgrave Richard Perkins of Hegel. His planet was in the midst of a plague epidemic, and the vital medical supplies were not reaching the system on account of the military requisitioning all available jump ships. Among the many dead were Perkins's family. As the noble approached within 4 meters of Steiner, he drew a laser pistol and went to shoot the Archon, when one of the Griffin battle mechs standing guard slammed his fist down between the two. Perkins was taken captive, and the LIC quickly discovered that he had been paid handsomely by their rivals in SAFE to kill Richard Steiner. Thankfully, the attempt on his life had failed. Though the Lyran noble was sentenced to death, the Archon commuted his sentence to life imprisonment, understanding how the tragedy on Hegel had forced Perkins's hand. The final actions of 2812 came in November, when a Free Will's force landed on Alula Borealis, taking control of the system by year's end. The Lyran Intelligence Corps reported that this was likely the last move the Captain General would make for some time now, having thoroughly exhausted his forces in the region. With a brief reprieve, the Archon made the decision to disband his newly acquired elite regiment, the Stealths, and spread their experienced mech warriors across the Commonwealth's military academies.
Why?
He hoped that they would inspire a new wave of more capable commanders to enter service within the LCAF, and hopefully rejuvenate his stagnant and uninspired officer corps. In late 2812, the AFFS landed on another trio of planets in their continued campaign to reclaim the entirety of the Federated Suns. 2 were captured in short order, but they faced a determined defense from the garrison on Nouveau-Toulouse. Supporting the Federated Suns in their advance was Duke in exile Lawrence Nelson. Forced to leave his homeworld, he took 5 battalions of his planetary guard with him, offering their services to Davian as pseudo-mercenaries. The planet was secured early in the new year, and the Combine Regiment destroyed. In March, troops were dispatched to the next wave of targets, capturing the remaining 6 systems by year's end.
There we go.
Those sent to Fairfield were particularly fortunate,
We're
as they
closing in,
discovered
guys.
the DCMS had packed up and left long before their arrival.
Ooh.
The Kirita Bulge had now been compressed down to its narrowest since the first week of Jinjiro's invasion. Next up were the primary targets of the counteroffensive,
Hey Eleanor, what's
Dahar
up?
and Robinson. The Lyran Intelligence Corps had reported that the Free World's border was likely to be quiet for the foreseeable future, as House Marik was dealing with the same supply and transport problems as the Commonwealth. What they failed to account for was that House Cameron Jones had several well-rested provincial regiments deep within the Principality of Regulus that could be moved up to the front line.
Oh my god.
Bella 1 was a world that had already changed hands twice during the First Succession War, but even still, it came as a shock when the FWLM arrived in April. The defenders were alerted to their presence as soon as they appeared at the zenith. Unsecured radio chatter revealed they faced 4 enemy regiments, a force they could not hope to hold off. Faced with the loss of his garrison, Colonel Hamlin decided to call for an immediate retreat off-world.
Good
The
idea.
Lyran aerospace fighters were ordered not to engage the incoming dropships so that they would be at maximum strength to escort the Lyran regulars out to their jump ships. The Regulan Hussars were the first down and immediately moved to prevent the withdrawal. A frenzied battle took place at the spaceport, but Hamlin was able to lift off with most of his forces.
There we go.
It was only when they were halfway to the system's nadir that they realized that the Freeworld's guards hadn't even arrived in system yet. Colonel Magain's reckless attack had been a ruse to make them think that he was outnumbered. The Lyran commander did not remain a colonel for much longer once High Command discovered he'd surrendered Bella so easily.
Grand Reaper, have a nice one.
Not everything was going the League's way in 2813, however.
Christian, you're not kidding. That place has changed hands too many times at this point. It's... all hail the new boss, same as the old boss.
In the spring, Comstar technician Emma Gomez at the Carver 5 base was discovered to be a safe operative feeding information back to the Captain General on Blake's activities.
Okay.
Their scheme was quickly foiled by Rom, and in the aftermath, Blake decided to expand the organization's internal security force to prevent any further leaks. The only other activity in 2813 occurred within the Tikhonov commonality. Paul Davian had hoped the loss at Chesterton would have dissuaded the Chancellor from making any other moves in the region, but the opportunistic Ilsa Liao knew that the First Prince was too busy with his counteroffensive to maintain much of a garrison in the region.
Okay.
Landing on Marik in July, they took the world for the Confederation 2 months later. They also repulsed combine assaults on Bryant, Epsilon Indy, and Ingress. Throughout
Collection
the First
service?
Succession War,
So, yes. So, ROM has become the billing service of Comstar. Nice.
Comstar under Jerome Blake was content to sit back and play a largely pacifist role in maintaining the Innisphere's HBG network. Ensuring their continued monopoly over all interstellar communications was their sole aim at this point in their history. They did what they could to avoid becoming targets for the rampaging successor states by decommissioning their battlemech factories and naval yards and secretly mothballing their hidden warship fleet. Operation Silver Shield was the last overt military action that they took back at the beginning of the conflict, and there are very few other incidents in which their involvement is only suspected. Lauren Hayes, who had led her SLDF forces to victory on Terra, both alongside Kerensky and under the orders of the First Circuit, would retire within the next 2 years. The Comstar expeditionary divisions would themselves be disbanded, and their assets put into long-term storage beneath their headquarters at the Hilton Head HBG on Terra. But this was not the end of Comstar's involvement in the Succession Wars. The past few years had seen the emergence and fast growth of a new power within their ranks, ROM. This shadowy internal security force, answerable solely to the Prime Administrator, would soon become a secret intelligence agency to rival any belonging to the Great Houses. The First Succession War would soon enter its final phase. Little did humanity know that one of the greatest opponents of peace had come into being, and was now spreading like a virus across the Innisphere.
Lovely. KGB mode activated. Oh. Peripheral vision. No.
Throughout the first 2.5 decades of the Succession Wars, the Periphery realms looked on in mute horror as the great houses of the Innisphere obliterated one another with weapons of mass destruction. No doubt some among the former territorial states considered this just desserts for those who had spent centuries exploiting them, but the cataclysm unleashed on the Innisphere so far surpassed the misery of the reunification and freedom wars that most felt deeply uncomfortable celebrating the news. It's important to realize that the Periphery only had a fragmentary understanding of what was transpiring in the Innisphere. Comstar was making little to no efforts to maintain their HBG network that far from Terra, nor replace those damaged in the uprising. From the perspective of the average citizen, they would have first heard of the growing tensions between the member states, and likely the pronouncements of the successor lords that they intended to rule the Star League. From that point on, the Concordat, Magistracy and Outworlds would surely have transitioned to a war footing if they weren't already. Invasion seemed imminent. Reports of an outbreak of hostilities along all borders would have had them preparing for the worst.
Yeah.
And rumors of planetary extinctions, if they could be believed, would no doubt have heightened the feeling of growing terror.
Yeah.
But over the next few years, the merchant jump ships they relied upon both for essential supplies and for accounts of the war steadily reduced in number. As the successor states commandeered ever more civilian vessels, and likely any foreign ones that entered their territory, less and less information was able to filter out to the periphery states. It would have been as if a supermassive black hole had appeared at the heart of the old Star League, and gradually expanded to engulf the inner sphere, swallowing everything in its reach. The news blackout likely created a feeling of deep uncertainty and paranoia. Perhaps.
Look, Canopus, you have cat girls. You're gonna be fine. Just cat girls. You'll be fine.
Some even wondered if they were all that was left.
That's a hell of a sensation.
The complete breakdown of interstellar travel had immediate and disastrous outcomes for the distant periphery. While they had craved freedom from the Star League, they still expected inner sphere traders to do business with them. Many colonies were entirely dependent on food shipments to survive, but with civilian transports regularly pressed into service with the Navy, what few independent merchants still existed had their hands full trying to keep their own nations hungry fed. None could risk traveling through open war zones to reach the periphery. This problem was exacerbated by a lack of diversification on many of the periphery worlds. As former territories of the League, the planetary economies were often hyper-focused on just one or two industries, or sometimes even a single product. When those closely interdependent worlds could no longer export their product or trade with their partners, economic collapse followed, hastening the rapid decline of many systems. Each passing year only worsened the issue until the outermost colonies began to starve. Despite being removed from the worst of the fighting, the periphery worlds suffered even greater numbers of abandonment than their warring counterparts. The fiercely isolationist systems of the Outworlds Alliance were the worst affected. Many of the newest and most distant were reliant on the continual flow of money and resources from the Terran hegemony, a nation-state that no longer existed. Those former hegemony citizens that fled in a mass exodus following the fall of the Star League often ended up out in these backwaters, only to suffer the same miseries they had hoped to flee. As the situation grew desperate, the Outworlds Alliance created a provisional relief force to assist in decolonizing non-viable worlds. The scarcity of food led to a sharp uptick in theft and piracy, necessitating a military presence to maintain law and order. Some Outworlds planets even went as far as hiring small mercenary bands to conduct raids on their supposed allies. Despite their best efforts, many starved long before help arrived. There is a certain sad irony to the fact that the Outworlds Alliance, who were not attacked by Davian or Kurita even once during the First Succession War, lost more worlds to famine or abandonment than any of the Great Houses. The barren systems of the Outworld's wastes live on in interstellar maps as a monument to so many millions of dead. In the wake of the Star League's collapse, banditry was on the rise across all known space. At the forefront of these new pirate kingdoms was the distant Tortuga Dominion, and several former Amaris holdings unsurprisingly became pirate enclaves too. The rump states of the former Rimworld's Republic had died out, the Oberon Confederation in 2796 and the Finnmark Free Republic a few years after that, both succumbing to the constant bandit raids and no small amount of meddling by the Lyrans. But the major periphery realms themselves were one of the biggest contributors to the growing epidemic. In the build-up towards the Freedom War, the territorial states had clandestinely funded several rebel or even terrorist groups in an effort to cause maximum unrest within the Star League. When Kerensky granted them their independence, they were left with a number of heavily armed bands who refused to swear fealty to the ruling houses.
That's bad.
Instead, they preyed upon the fringe systems while the government was busy trying to rebuild. The remnants of the secret army inadvertently left these rebels with enormous weapon stockpiles that meant they were far beyond the ability of local police to deal with. It was a problem that would continue for years or even decades before peace was finally restored. The rare shipyards still operating in the Periphery could not avoid becoming targets for pirates, or perhaps even covert attacks from the Innisphere intelligence agencies. The facilities at both Canopus and Taurus were destroyed, and the Outworlds decommissioned their sole naval base, both due to a lack of parts and to avoid becoming a target.
That's a good idea,
To help
actually.
bring an end to the fighting, several new regiments cropped up across the Periphery. The Hades Light Infantry and Cassandra's Volunteers were reformed, the Pleiades Hussars were expanded, and the Outworlds created the Remora Guards. When the Periphery military...
That does happen sometime, Kristen. The Periphery right now reminds me of what happened to Africa when the USSR fell. You had a whole bunch of powers that were not militarily strong, and now all of a sudden, if you had the money for it, you could arm yourself sufficiently to do whatever you wanted. And anybody that tried to do anything positive just was simply outgunned. Lee, thanks, bud. Fun fact, Tortuga Dominion was founded by Star League troops. The Babe Keeler sent as one last raid going rogue due to low morale. Thanks, Furlough. I know what you're talking about now. There you go. Yeah. Low morale. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. This reminds me so much, like from what was being said about this. You have more than enough guns, but not enough good governance. And you have too many people that just don't want to do what they want to do. A multi-planet bush war, exactly wasteland.
Militaries weren't hunting bandits, they were busy preparing for what still felt like an inevitable invasion. Even after 25 years, they were still vastly outnumbered by their old oppressors, and it seemed as if at any moment they could turn outwards and unleash hell upon them. While the successor states had enough raw manpower to weather the devastation, if the same tactics were employed against the Periphery, it risked a sudden and terminal collapse.
Yeah.
But the sword of Damocles never fell, and instead the decades-long standoff led to a line of strategic reasoning that we now refer to as the piranha principle.
Huh.
In nature, individual piranhas will violently and relentlessly attack any prey or potential rival, including other piranhas. However, shoals of piranhas can grow to as many as 1,000 fish without them turning on one another in a bloodbath. This is because to attack any of the piranhas around them risks opening themselves to an attack from another, meaning such behavior inevitably leads to their own death. Likewise, the succession wars as a whole exhibit this same behavior. Individually, any single successor state could take on and annihilate one of their smaller periphery neighbours. However, to do so would require redeploying the forces along their other borders to face their new target, and doing that would expose themselves to an attack. The stalemate that had developed by this point in the war, and continues on to this day, ensures that no one can ever land a knockout blow. It is because of the piranha principle that the smaller periphery states can continue to exist in such close proximity to far larger and more dangerous hostile neighbours.
Makes sense.
In the roughly 240 years that the succession wars have raged, only one major campaign has ever involved the periphery states. By 2813, control of the Taurian Concordat had passed to Protector Semyon Calderon. An imminent Davian invasion had been threatened for some 25 years by this point, but the lack of activity along their border had Calderon and the Taurian Defense Force looking elsewhere for opportunities to strengthen their realm. Lying just beyond their borders were the systems of Detroit and Heratitus. Nominally under the protection of the Magistracy of Canopus, but kept demilitarized by the SLDF, their proximity and sparse garrison made them attractive prizes. In June 2813, the TDF began moving. Strategic command was given to Marshal Blake Andrews, who led the Red Chasseurs towards Detroit, but the first task force to reach their destination were the Pleiades Hussars. Appearing at the zenith of Heratitus, they made little effort to conceal their arrival, allowing a jump ship time to depart and bring word back to the magistracy. A relaxed burn towards their target gave the Planetary militia ample time to launch their aerospace fighters, an asset which the Taurians failed to identify in any significant numbers. Numbers they had though, and the damage they inflicted as the enemy dropships entered atmosphere was extreme. More than 2 battalions of mechs and over a regiment of conventional forces were wiped out. The Taurian comptroller paid for his arrogance, as he was one of the first to be shot out of the sky. What few survivors made landfall promptly surrendered.
Escape. Hey, thanks, bud. As someone born and raised in Africa, it has not changed much. When the Soviet Union collapsed and arms became readily available in Africa, all of a sudden you had all these people that were pissed off at each other that could start shooting each other with advanced weaponry now. It just evolved warfare in Africa very, very quickly. Because now you had this same kind of feuding warlords who were originally kept in check by the governments, now as strong as the governments. If you want to look at when things because oh man, the 90s were a bad time. The 90s were a horrific time for anyone living in Africa, in any country that had seen any kind of like rebel groups or anything like that wouldn't initially have been kept in check by the government, being better armed and better supplied. All of a sudden, the local warlord, could all of a sudden wind up being stronger than the government forces, and in some cases, you saw so many states that it will just suddenly fail. Yeah, Africa and Yugoslavia were hotspots in the 90s. Yep, like Somalia, Ethiopia. A lot of these states would just wind up having major issues. Somalia fell apart as a country. We didn't even recognize Somalia as a sovereign nation in the early 2000s. We just didn't. They didn't have colonial power suppressing local issues just like the Levant. Yeah. Yemen. So many areas that, the government was maintaining nominal power, but then all of a sudden, when the Soviet Union fell apart, now the government, when you can buy a case of Kalashnikovs for as cheap as they were being sold, it turned the whole place into a hellhole.
When Magistrix Rawana Centrella got wind of the so-called Heratitis crisis, she immediately set about organizing a military response. Unaware that the invaders had long since surrendered, she dispatched a pair of her own regiments to seize neutral Spencer on the way towards a strike on the Concordat itself. Meanwhile, Blake Andrews arrived at Detroit. 5 regiments under the command of the Taurian Guards General Natal Chowdhury touched down in good order and set about chasing down the militia forces. Despite their numbers advantage, unfamiliarity with the terrain meant they struggled to catch their quarry even after several months had transpired. Spencer was to be the first outing for the reformed Cassandra's volunteers. Though the planet was officially neutral, the Star League had declared it within the Concordat sphere of influence, despite its proximity to the magistracy. What might at first appear as an administrative error was intentional on the part of the League, as they sought to keep the two territories vying against each other instead of uniting against the High Council. The Taurian-leaning militia, far from being caught by surprise, were able to prepare an ambush for the approaching regiment after identifying their primary objective through signal eavesdropping. They allowed the MAF units to enter the capital unmolested, only springing their trap once they were deep within the urban jungle. At the same time, fighters launched an attack on their dropships, cutting them off from a possible retreat. Cassandra's volunteers surrendered after the first battle, but had already suffered casualties of around 50%. The attack on Portland, the only significant battle to take place within the territory of one of the Periphery nations during the First Succession War, was as unsuccessful as all prior engagements during the Magistracy Concordat conflict. The Canopian Light Horse was at least able to swiftly take control of the capital, but after a few failed attempts to halt guerrilla activity, They instead pillaged the city for anything of value and withdrew to their dropships, just in time to receive word that the two realms were already in peace talks. Quickly realizing the futility of the conflict, a ceasefire between the two states was ratified in February 2814. The campaign had been a disaster.
Unbelievable. Okay, so say what you will about the Taurians and the Canopus. They sat there and they just they looked at each other, they threw a punch, they hit each other in the face, and they realized, this is really stupid. Why are we doing this? Good on them.
For the Taurians, and particularly House Calderon. Both parties blamed Protector Semyon for inciting conflict where before there had been none. He tried to deflect blame by removing Marshal Blake Andrews and appointing Chowdhury as the new head of the TDF, but the legacy of defeat would follow him for the next 2 years until he was eventually forced to resign. Protector Reina Arantino was chosen by the Privy Council as his successor.
Okay.
The MAF had acquitted itself poorly as well, but their response had at least come quickly, their failures proving less consequential to the magistracy and House Centrella. Events in the Periphery went largely unnoticed by those back in the Inner Sphere. They were far too preoccupied with their own conflict to spare a thought for the distant colonies dropping off the map. The responsibility for logging the gradual abandonment of deep space fell to Comstar, the only sufficiently large entity not currently engaged in destruction. But with so little interest in the Periphery, they had little incentive to actively search for evidence of a colony's continued survival.
That's lovely.
In more than a few cases, planets that might have been viable withered and died because Comstar had prematurely removed them from the same astronavigation charts that the...
Yeah, but this is like literally, it's literally the best case scenario, because the Taurians punched Canopus, Canopus punched back, and then they just sat there and looked at each other like, this is really stupid. Why are we even doing this? And it only took them 2 battles to figure it out.
few remaining merchant vessels were using to plot a course through the region. Some have even speculated that this was intentional on Blake's part, some petty retribution against those who he believed had brought down the Star League. The question is, how many of those supposedly dead worlds still survive today, hidden from the rest of humanity's view?
Oh. Comstar is doing sneaky breaky. AT&T has a secret base near you. Yeah, but Scapegoat, peace is a stalemate. Peace is a stalemate. And the thing about it is, they didn't just keep on slugging at each other. I'm just saying. Well, damn.
The time had come for the armed forces of the Federated Suns to launch their attack on the heavily defended DCMS command bases on Dahar and Robinson. In March 2814, a warship squadron was dispatched to each system to clear a path for the ground invasions. Only a single ancient vessel moved to oppose them at Dahar, no match for the trio of Davian ships arriving, but the nuclear arsenal it carried meant that it would drag 2 of them down into the abyss along with it. After that, the surface battle proved to be a complete anticlimax. Despite fearing a large fortified garrison, the Combine had actually withdrawn most of its forces before they could be cut off.
There we go.
A brief skirmish outside the capital city was enough to reclaim Dahar. The same was not true for Robinson, capital of the entire Draconis March. As before, the Federated Suns Navy dispatched a trio of vessels to take control of the space lanes, facing off with 2 of the Draconis Combine Admiralty's few remaining warships, including what was once the flagship of the DCA's now extinct Second Fleet. The 2
If Battlestar Galactica, let's say Galactica showed up right here and right now. That's actually really good. They would be able to take command. They would be able to do some serious work, but at the same time, I think Galactica would be pretty much the same technological level that the Battletech would have. I think it would have that. I think it would be, a very large battleship comparatively, but it was still susceptible to nukes. It wouldn't really. It would be a additional ship. Like a relatively, better ship, but the Jupiter class, yeah, it would just be a boon to whatever house got a hold of it, if it got a hold of anything, but there wouldn't be really any massive world-changing benefit.
Command ships engaged each other while the destroyers paired off, and the aerospace fighters entered into a melee of their own. Hanging back until all others had committed were 3 squadrons of land air mechs. When an opportunity presented itself, they rushed the new Samarkand and boarded the carrier after transitioning into battle mech form. The experienced crew on board was one of the finest remaining in service to Kurita, but were powerless to stop such a heavy assault force. The warship detonated minutes later, taking many of the boarding team with it. Soon after, the last of the Combine's naval defense was destroyed, at which point Marshal Holder Davian ordered his task force to begin landing procedures.
Nice.
At least 2 DCMS regiments were reported on planet, split between the major cities. An overwhelming AWFS task force swept through the battlemech defenses within a week, but the infantry had gone to ground inside the residential districts, forcing a protracted struggle to root out the last of them, during which time several chemical weapons were used, poisoning the waterways. By sheer coincidence, the attack on Robinson coincided with a prison break staged by the cadets of the planet's military academy. The Draconis March capital had fallen so long ago that the survivors were now in their 40s.
Appreciate it, man.
They took control of the prison facilities' anti-air emplacements just as Holder Davian was coming under fire from the Curitan fighters outside the complex, helping to sway the battle in the AWFS's favor. By May, both Dahar and Robinson were securely under Federated Sun's control.
There we go.
Paul Davian had to decide how much further he wanted to push his luck. His troops, still buoyed by the successive victories they had achieved, were nevertheless reaching a point of exhaustion. They could not maintain the speed of their earlier advance.
True.
With that in mind, he stretched out his time plan and withdrew what he could for recuperation in safer regions. He also moved troops to the Capellan border, who were once again nibbling at the Chesterton welds, taking Farwell after a brief 1-month battle in June. The counteroffensive began again towards the end of the year. In the last 2 months of 2814, the AWFS made landfall on Glenmora, Clethandu, and Sakara.
Clethandu. It's an ugly planet! A bug planet!
Like the cadets on Robinson, those Sakara Academy students who had taken up arms had to wait almost 3 decades to see their home liberated.
Whew.
At Clethandu, Curitan warships unleashed a devastating orbital barrage on the ground forces below, prompting a nuclear exchange between the 2 commanders. The planet would survive, but it was one of the lowest points of the campaign for Davian. The year had gone poorly for the Free Worlds League. A raid on Holt by the Chevaux Leger had resulted in the complete destruction of the Green Orloff Grenadiers in garrison, but worse was to follow in 2815.
Okay.
An extremely virulent bioweapon was unleashed on the planet Jardine by unknown forces.
Comstar.
The world was home to some 40 or 50 million, but Thaddeus Marik was forced to enact a complete quarantine or risk having the bioagent spread beyond the system, leaving the inhabitants to their sad fate. Nearby, the Lyran High Command began what would be only their second major offensive of the Succession Wars, Operation Spiderweb.
Okay.
The brainchild of Hauptmann General Ranier Hogarth, the goal was to push the Free Worlds League out of the Solaris Bulge and take for themselves the economic powerhouses of Kalidasa and the game world Solaris itself.
Okay.
2 task groups were organized on either side of the region, each comprising a trio of regulars and one of the Elysian Lancers regiments. The operation commenced in February, with the dual assaults on Uhuru and Wing. Hogarth's campaign was slow and deliberate, about the only strategy the LCAF was capable of at that point in the war, but it was nonetheless successful. The massively outnumbered FWLM garrisons could not hope to match them. With victory achieved, they waited for conventional reinforcements to arrive before departing to their next targets.
Okay.
2815 saw only limited action along the Federated Suns border. Between March and October, the Federated Suns took back Breed, Royal, and Talmadge.
We are extremely close to the Davians pushing the Cretans completely out of their space and reestablishing the old borders.
To help reinforce their struggling defensive line, Kurita hired on the Paul Bunyan Regiment of mixed AEAF and SLDF vintage. The collapse of the Combine's invasion was having a distinct impact on the Kuritan officer corps. The veterans,
yeah, they started having their guts go everywhere,
were dropping like flies. Many were so ashamed by their inability to hold the AFFS that they decided to commit seppuku.
Well, hopefully they would commit seppuku right alongside them. I'm just saying.
It became an endemic problem
I hated
for the
the ending too,
DCMS,
71.
to the point where Jinjiro Kurita was forced to step in and outlaw the practice completely. He also had to reel in his own brutalistic treatment of those who failed him, as the number of qualified commanders continued to dwindle.
Yeah.
This was both a blessing and a curse for the Fed Sons. The replacement officers were young green cadets straight out of school. While they lacked experience, they did not feel the same shame their predecessors did regarding the Canari massacre, and so fought with renewed vigor. One of the strangest curiosities to come out of 2815 occurred within the Capellan Confederation.
Oh?
Bordering the Chesterton commonality was the planet Westphalia, garrisoned by a regiment of their voltigeurs. It was close enough to the front that they could expect trouble, but otherwise of little strategic importance. When a raiding party did arrive, it did so from an entirely unexpected source. Freeman's fanatics were mercenaries employed by House Steiner. The exact reason for such a deep strike is lost to history, with some speculating it was either an attempt to recover information found by a Lyran agent, or perhaps the fallout of a failed alliance between the Commonwealth and Confederation. In early 2816, the Bella system once again became the site of a battle between Marik and Steiner.
Okay.
The Lyran regulars, who had retreated so ingloriously, were now returning. They had spent the last 2 years training under Raymond Hempstead, the former colonel of the Stealths Regiment. He was given command of the operation, seconded by Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Steiner, the Archon's son and heir.
You guys kept on saying Hesperus would be the big one. I've heard Bella so many damn times in this, it's just insane at this point. Bella has changed hands over and over and over and over again.
Political squabbling within the Free Worlds League gave them the opportunity they had been waiting for, as the Regulan Hussars returned back to their principality, leaving the defense of Bella open. The new garrison had only just arrived on Weld when the attack commenced.
Welcome to hell,
Hempstead's
asshole!
signature maneuvering tactics brought the battle to a swift end in March. In the wake of the battle at Bella, the grizzled stealth veteran was recalled to Tharkad, leaving command to the now brevet colonel Marcus Steiner. Hempstead had impressed the Archon with how he had improved the abilities of the Lyran regulars under his command. Richard Steiner now paired him with a few of the retired mech warriors of the Stealths and Tamar Tigers, and tasked them with doing the same for the 54th Lyran Guards. Back in February, the AFFS took aim at 4 more worlds belonging to House Kurita, including the Bene system, a pre-war holding of theirs. The slow but steady campaign succeeded in driving them off by November. Meanwhile, the Capellans launched another invasion of Castleton in July. 2 months later, the planet was once again flying the banner of House Liao. Paul Davian was tiring of these constant attacks in the region, and so had authorized a new front to be opened within the Cyan and St. Ives commonalities, two regions that had barely seen any fighting during the war.
Oh boy.
The Certis Fusiliers took point, and by the end of the year had secured 6 new worlds for the Capellan March.
This is the find out portion.
This came at the cost of 2 regiments, and so further advances were called off. It had done the job though, as Liao would not strike at the Federated Suns again for years. The Commonwealth borders were particularly active throughout 2816. Bella was just one of the systems taken from Marik, as Operation Spiderweb pressed deeper into the Solaris Bulge.
Ooh.
Their objective was to attack the Duchy of Kalidasa from 2 sides and cut off any defenders on the capital. Over the next year or 2, each of the task forces would take a trio of planets.
Getting pinched.
Marik was trying to organize a response, but Capellan raids on his spinward flank kept him off balance. On the Curitan front, the Draconis Combine had taken 7 worlds from the Commonwealth over the last few years, and destroyed another regiment while they were at it. However, Richard Steiner's decision to break up the stealths and send them to the academies was starting to pay dividends.
Uh-oh.
The commanders within the Tamar Pact launched a successful campaign along the border between the Benjamin and Rosalhague military districts, taking 7 more systems back in that same period. 2817 would be the penultimate year of the Davian counteroffensive, beginning in March with attacks on Allerton, Courtney, Emporia, and Sauk City. As they drew ever closer to what was considered firm House Curita territory, the First Prince became more cautious of increased civilian resistance and attacks staged from deeper within the Combine. By September, the 4 planets had returned to the Federated Suns, and a couple of months later, they made their last moves of the year against Bettendorf, Crossing, and Franklin.
There we go.
Also targeted was Lima across their Stalingrad border, where another of the Gallatin Regulars regiments was destroyed. In April, the Free Wills League launched the final offensive of what had once been the Boland Thumb. The invasion of Kavanagh and Ilion were of secondary note compared to what would be the 5th battle for Bella, not counting the many raids against the planet. Coinciding with the attacks was another raid launched against the capital of Rancher within the Federation of Sky. 2 months earlier, Marcus Steiner had received a shipment of tactical nukes on Bella, assigning them primarily to his aerospace assets. Additional reinforcements came from one of the last Essex-class destroyers in the Navy. Despite his privileged birth, Marcus was not merely in command because of his name. He had learned well from Colonel Hempstead and was prepared to resist the FWLM. Escorting the 3 Marik battlemech regiments to Bella were a pair of Carracks. Originally envisioned as an armed transport and not a mainline warship, they stood little hope of overcoming the hostile destroyer, something which became readily apparent when the lead vessel disintegrated under the Edelweiss's cannon fire within just 2 minutes. Recognizing that she was outgunned, Captain Monica Talassi ordered her crew to abandon ship. As they made for the lifeboats, she took the controls and piloted it on a collision course with the Lyran destroyer. Edelweiss evaded too late, and the entire starboard side of the warship was ripped off before a magazine explosion detonated both vessels. With both sides losing their naval support early, the remaining forces were closely matched. The FWLM had strength in numbers, both battlemechs and aerospace fighters, but Steiner's fighters were equipped with tactical warheads which evened the playing field.
Yes, I cast nuke is usually an appropriate response in this war.
The Lyran regulars proved to be highly evasive, picking and choosing when to engage in battle only at favourable moments. But the League troops proved equally skilled, and by December it had become clear that the LCAF would need to withdraw. Casting aside what equipment they couldn't take with them, Marcus and his regulars departed for their jump ships. When the Marik units moved in to seize their prize, booby traps among the abandoned mechs detonated the remaining nuclear weapons, inflicting another 2 companies of casualties on the victorious Free Wills League. This would prove to be the last battle on this part of the front, both sides now turning their attention towards the Solaris Bulge. The Capellan war machine was grinding to a halt at this point in the war. Another of the Capellan charges had succumbed to their losses in 2817, and battlefield attrition meant less than 10% of their regiments could field even 2 battalions. The planets themselves were suffering from the damage too, as vital environmental systems were either destroyed or broke down due to the lack of replacement parts. To help maintain some of the equipment that was quickly becoming branded as lost tech, Liao established the Capellan Science Foundation in 2818.
Okay.
Other similar institutions would appear across the Inner Sphere in the years and decades to come, but the rampant destruction meant that preserving advanced technology was becoming an ever greater challenge. In April, Paul Davian launched the final 3 planetary liberations of the counteroffensive. 2 months later, Marik, Sheet, and Tripoli were restored to the Federated Suns.
There we go.
With the Draconis Combine pushed more or less back to their pre-war borders, plus a handful of their own worlds taken by Davian for good measure, the First Prince called a halt to the campaign. Pushing the mustered soldiery back became more difficult with each passing year. Continuing the assault risked having nothing left with which to hold on to their reclaimed territory. The war had cost House Kurita 20 battlemech regiments on this front alone. The exact date of their destruction is lost to the chaos of the First Succession War, but the vast majority either fell or surrendered post-Canari massacre, making the atrocity the most costly mistake of Jinjiro's reign of terror.
Yeah.
By the end of 2818, the Lyran Commonwealth's Operation Spiderweb completed the first phase of their efforts to secure the valuable Solaris system when the 2 task forces regrouped within the Duchy of Kaladasa on Alx and New Hope, less than 3 light years away. The Free Worlds League had not laid down and surrendered yet, destroying one of the Donegal guards and retaking 4 of the 10 systems Hauptmann General Hogarth had seized. Nevertheless, the encirclement of the provincial capital was now complete. In the new year, the 7 remaining regiments would combine to make an overwhelming assault on Kaladasa. As 2819 began, combat activity across the Inner Sphere was in a terminal decline, as exhaustion and lack of equipment became a rampant issue within each of the successor state militaries. In the final 5 years of the war, only 2 systems exchanged hands on the Capellan Free Worlds border. Tit-for-tat action on Matheran the previous year showed that both sides barely had the strength to hold an objective, and the loss of one of the Confederation's mercenary regiments underlined the reality that House Liao could no longer muster an offensive at this stage. On the opposite side of the Inner Sphere, the Draconis Combine was making the last of its major raiding campaigns against the Lyran Commonwealth, targeting Alexandria, Kessel, and Tamar. Another unit was dispatched to the edge, only to discover that the world was completely without garrison, netting Kurita an easy conquest. Other than that, the 2 realms took just 2 other systems from each other as the fighting came to a halt. The Federated Suns found itself dangerously overextended along the Combine border. Paul Davian made the difficult decision to withdraw from 9 systems he had fought hard to take over the past 2 decades. Some of these were long-time Kuritan holdings with unruly populaces, but others had welcomed the Fed Suns liberators with open arms. In total, fighting within the occupied territory, both during the initial invasion and the counteroffensive, have resulted in the deaths of more than 1 billion people.
Oof.
The last major offensive of the First Succession War, Operation Spiderweb, entered its final phase in February 2819. The garrison at Rochelle had been redeployed to the nearby provincial capital, meaning the planet fell to Ranier Hogarth's task force almost immediately. Expecting them to follow the same plodding advance as they had up to this point, the forces on Kaladasa and Solaris struck out in April, hoping to liberate some of the worlds the Hauptmann General had seized during the advance. As the Marik forces approached their jump ships, Lyran warships entered the system, escorting all 7 regiments that had only just taken Rochelle. The Steiner commander had not bothered to wait for reinforcements to secure the planet, and instead banked on their attack catching the Duke of Kaladasa flat-footed, which it did.
Yeah.
The system wasn't totally without defense, however, as waiting at the zenith were the last FWLM warships in the region. By this point in the war, there were barely any surviving shipyards capable of servicing such vessels, and so not one of the warships was fully functional. only the LCS Chaffee survived the engagement, which also claimed most of the Marik militia who were caught in space. The attack group made landfall 9 days later, the surviving garrison surrendering 2 months after that. With Solaris now totally surrounded, Hogarth enacted his master plan. Instead of dispatching his task force to claim the game world, he sent diplomats. The population was already in unrest as news filtered in and their situation became clear. However, the last thing Steiner wanted was for the hordes of mech gladiators on planet to take to the field to protect their home.
Right.
Intense urban fighting would surely follow if that happened, leading to widespread destruction. The Lyran diplomats offered the civilian government special status within the Commonwealth as a neutral system under the protection of the LCAF, in exchange for a cut of the planet's profits. After 3 months of debate, Solaris seceded from the Free Worlds League on September 10th and demanded that the FWLM garrison withdraw by the end of the year. The Marik commander prepared to seize the capital and enact martial law, but when it became clear that no help would be coming, they reluctantly departed for safer territory. The Lyran Commonwealth moved into their new holding early in the new year. The transition had caused a minimum of disruption, for which the locals were thankful. Operation Spiderweb had been a huge success for House Steiner. Reclaiming the Bowl and Thumb had removed an ever-present threat to their realm, as well as righting a perceived wrong dating back to before the Star League. But the capture of Kalidasa and Solaris, two enormously wealthy systems that had avoided the worst of the succession wars, was a far greater boon to their economy. Other systems in the region had been less fortunate. Shertan and Uhuru had been reduced to a shadow of their former glory. The Free Worlds League was not above petty retribution, however.
Of course.
In one of the few collaborations between realms in the First Succession War, in 2820, the Red Eagles Mercenary Battalion in the employ of the Draconis Combine was loaned out to the Free Worlds League to hit their shared enemy, the Lyran Commonwealth. Partnering with Clinton's cutthroats, the two units struck at Solaris in March. A reliance on mercenaries for attacks like this was becoming ever more common during the final years of the war, with the Free Worlds also signing on Salicia's Defiance that year. The raiders sent to Solaris had come to cause as much destruction as possible, particularly to the water treatment facilities on planet. The two inflicted considerable damage before the garrison was able to organize and force them to depart. But as they did so, their warship escort maneuvered overhead to bombard Solaris City from orbit, killing thousands below.
Of course.
The raiding party withdrew soon after. This act of revenge may have hurt the planet's population, but it would ensure that they would never willingly submit to Marik rulership again.
Yep.
Despite the blow to relations between the two states, the reality of the First Succession War was becoming clear to both ruling houses. In late 2820, diplomats convened on Bela and began peace talks.
Of course they would meet on Bela. Bela's a system they fought over the absolute most. It changed hands so many times. And hey, they already have the flags there. You don't really need to ship any flags there or anything because, you know, the second that one power got taken out, they just switched over all the iconography. They already had it all there. Perfect place for a diplomatic summit, I'm telling you. They have fought themselves to the point of past exhaustion.
Like so many terrible conflicts in history, the loss of life in what would be the final year of the First Succession War is all the more tragic because every side by this point understood that a ceasefire was imminent. After 3.5 decades of carnage, they could no longer continue to wage total war against one another. Yet despite this, those in charge persisted in ordering raids and even 11th hour invasions right up to the bitter end. The Capellans had managed to force the Marik militia off Kwamashu the previous year. but ultimately withdrew once House Allison sent in reinforcements. Ilsa Liao's main focus was on the Davian front. A raid on Helix Mar and the capture of Rollis kicked off 2821 before she launched her final land grab in February. The CCAF made use of fast-moving Locust battle mechs to run rings around the garrison on Ulaanbaatar, taking back control of the contested system.
You lost the Locusts?
Striking at targets of opportunity across their respective border, Davian and Kurita also undertook their final raids of the war. The AFFS would take this one step further, a late invasion seizing control of the immensely wealthy New Aberdeen in the hopes it could help rebuild the devastated Draconis March. The proximity of the fighting caused the nearby Anting University to organise its student body into 4 regiments, offering their services to the DCMS as their rivals from the Sunzang Military Academy had for many years. Colonel Raymond Hempstead had spent the latter years of the war training one of the Lyran Guards regiments in fast attack tactics and manoeuvre warfare, hoping they would become the spiritual successor to the famed stealths. Lyran High Command, spurred on by the successful capture of Utrecht at the beginning of the year, ordered a last-minute jab at the Draconis Combine as a way to trial their new performance. Now known as Hempstead's Greyhounds, the unit was dispatched on a deep raid against Otho, an attack that would prove disastrous.
Of course.
Despite his tutelage, the regiment was still untested, and the engagement on Otho proved to be their last. Hempstead, who had unsuccessfully petitioned to be sent along with his students, was distraught by their loss. Richard Steiner, meanwhile, was enraged that such a foolish venture had been attempted and demoted all those responsible.
Good!
He recalled the former stealth commander back to Tharkad. When Hempstead arrived, the Archon declared that the former Amaris Empire soldier was to be promoted to Hauptmann General and given command of training operations within the LCAF.
Very smart.
He was dispatched to the Curitan front to take full control of the region.
Yeah, let's go.
In the last and perhaps most ill-conceived move of the war, Captain General Thaddeus Marik decided to launch an attack on Gironnet in April in retaliation for a raid on Wing. The planet had fallen to the Commonwealth some 3 decades earlier, but rather than try to use it as a bargaining chip in the ongoing peace talks on Bella, he decided to take it by force. Leaving his flagship in orbit, Thaddeus took to the field to take command of the operation. On May 7th, as he met with his officers to discuss tactics for the upcoming battle, an artillery shell impacted his tent, and the Captain General was killed.
Do I hear 6?
In an ironic twist, just 9 days later,
that's 6. Do I hear 7?
Marik and Steiner would sign the Peace Accord of Bella I, the First Nations of the Succession Wars to formally end the conflicts between them.
There we go.
When the Minister of Tikhonov, Dmitry Rogozin, tentatively called for an armistice around Chesterton, he found that the Federated Sons was open to the suggestion, with a formal truce agreed on September 24th.
There we go.
Likewise, Duke Jonathan Humphreys approached the Capellan Confederation looking to establish a ceasefire, which Ilsa Liao ultimately agreed to in late November, ceding control of the contested Andurian systems back over to the Free Worlds League. By December, fighting between the Combine and Commonwealth had tapered off, but there was little hope of ever reaching a peace agreement with such an aggressive militaristic state. The same unofficial ceasefire extended to the Federated Sons border. Raiding still took place, but rarely did it involve even a battalion of ground troops.
So it's not even an armistice, it's just we're not fighting anymore.
The surviving successor lords at this time were looking around at the Inner Sphere to see what their conquests had won them.
Nothing.
Certainly, the border regions had been hit hardest, but the loss of civilian transport meant that the human suffering extended deep into each realm, as colonies were forced to abandon their homes or simply left to wither.
Okay, so the Free Worlds League and the Steiners, the Lyran Commonwealth, they have a truce. The Capellans and the Federated Sons have a truce. The Caretans don't have a truce with anybody, but everybody's just kind of like sitting back, like, you don't get out of your chair, I'm not getting out of mine.
And die without vital food or medical aid. Rationing had been in effect on almost every planet for 3 decades. Throughout our history of the conflict, we've mentioned specific raids when known.
Oh, they do
but
have
the
a truce, my
strikes
bad.
against those rare naval bases capable of constructing or servicing warships never ceased. 6 more were destroyed over the course of the war, 3 crippled permanently, and another 3 badly damaged. Overall production of jump ships was down by 95% compared to 2786. The Lyran Commonwealth, still the most industrious of the 5 successor states, had their manufacturing output halved. The new Dieron military district had lost more than 60% of its industrial capacity, and for House Davian, their income was less than 25% of their pre-war figures.
Oh my god!
The military losses were extreme. Some of the figures often quoted belie just how bad things were. For example, the Lyran Commonwealth began the war with 120 battlemech regiments on its rolls. Even including those units destroyed or disbanded, wartime production meant that in 28-21 they actually had 10 more mech regiments on the table. But out of all those units, the number of regiments operating just 2 full battalions was 4. And the LCAF was the military that came out of the First Succession War the best.
Oh my god!
The hardest hit were the armed forces of the Federated Sons,
Of course.
who had lost more than 62% of their strength, primarily fighting House Kurita. The human cost is truly unknowable. The chaos unleashed by absolute total warfare means that any figures will always be estimates. It's beyond question that tens of billions were killed in the First Succession War, but some sources count up into the hundreds of billions
That
once
wouldn't
indirect
surprise me.
casualties are factored in.
Especially the indirect casualties, like what happened with the Outer Worlds Alliance. Like they had, like, not only that, so many planets were just completely rendered uninhabitable. 148 worlds were struck from the mass. My god. Yeah.
A 28-24 survey by the Comstar Safe Transit and Astronavigation Project found that 22 colonies across the inner sphere had been destroyed from either bombardment or nuclear weapons. But on top of that, 31 were wiped out by disease, 72 planets died from famine, and another 23 succumbed to some other disaster.
Hey, Valk.
People will naturally ask, who won the First Succession War?
Not a damn soul.
The only appropriate answer is, no one did.
Comstar did.
Every realm came out of the conflict worse than they did when it started, whether they had directly participated in the fighting or not. We can, of course, look at it dispassionately and see that certain parties lost less than others. The Free Worlds League under Kenyan Marik had made enormous inroads into the Capellan Confederation and looked to be well on their way to dealing a knockout blow to House Liao until the invasion stalled. Their biggest accomplishment was reclaiming the ancestral home of both House Humphreys of Andurian and House Orloff of Carbonus. Unfortunately, all that goodwill went up in smoke when Thaddeus Marik secured his position as Captain General through political strong-arming. Their intelligence agency SAFE had also lost the vast majority of their agents outside of the League, leaving them blind to events beyond their borders.
Oh my god.
Significant losses to the Lyran Commonwealth, notably the Bolan Thumb, and a military that was reduced by more than 60% preclude House Marik from being considered the winners.
Yeah.
The Capellan Confederation Armed Forces, despite also suffering 60% casualties, actually gained compared to their immediate rivals, coming out ahead of the FWLM and much closer to the AFFS. However, they had failed to capture their primary objective for the war, Chesterton. Furthermore, several of the worlds taken from the Terran hegemony had been lost to the Draconis Combine, a new dangerous entity on their Corwood border. Coupled with the many systems now belonging to Marik or their allies, House Liao is definitely one of the losers. The Federated Sons' counteroffensive under Paul Davian was amazingly successful, liberating almost all of the worlds they had lost up to that point. It came at an enormous cost, as previously mentioned, but it was nevertheless a victory for the First Prince, who had further cemented his own power at home. But calling the Fed Sons a winner after the humiliation they suffered in the first decade of the conflict is dishonest.
Yeah.
They were on the brink of utter destruction, and their recovery was a miracle made possible only through the atrocities committed by their arch-rivals. Further, the civilian population of the Davian realm was one of the worst affected by the conflict, with millions perishing from either starvation or disease after
Let's put a B on front of that, that's more accurate.
the loss of vital water purification technology on many raided worlds. The Draconis Combine was the only nation to gain on all three fronts, against the Federated Suns, the Lyran Commonwealth, the Terran Hegemony, and through them the Capellan Confederation. Reclaiming the Dieron system was something they took particular pride in. Their military losses, though severe, were not quite as bad as the AFFS, who they had campaigned against. At home, these conquests were touted as a great victory for House Kurita, but privately, the collapse of Jinjiro's offensive had been a disaster. For them to come so close to outright domination over House Davian, only to stumble at the final step, was an indignity the Coordinator struggled to deal with. With increasing frequency, Jinjiro was starting to show signs of a degenerative mental condition.
Starting to show signs of a... Starting. That's the word for it. That's the word for it. I think he's been showing signs of that for some time. I think he's been showing signs of that for quite a while now.
Ironically, despite the Lyran Commonwealth Armed Forces consistently underperforming throughout the entire war, House Steiner came out ahead of their rivals, primarily because the brutal campaigns of Kenyan Marik and Jinjiro Kurita were targeting the opposite side of the Inner Sphere. The LCAF had begun the conflict on a relatively even keel with the FWLM and slightly behind the DCMS. Now, they were almost on par with the mustered soldiery and significantly ahead of the Free Worlds League military. Additionally, the key industrial world of Hesperus had survived 3 separate attempts to destroy it. Its survival guaranteed that House Steiner's armed forces would recover faster than their rivals. What systems the Draconis Combine claimed along their Spinwood border were more than offset by the removal of the Bolan Thumb and capture of Solaris and its neighbouring worlds, though House Kelswa would surely disagree. But as Steiner looked at the condition of those planets, they, like all those who had conquered worlds during the war, quickly discovered the miserable state of affairs on the ground. There was virtually nothing of value left in any of the border systems that so much blood had been spilled over.
Oh my goodness.
A shaky peace had slowly crept its way over the Inner Sphere. First between the Free Worlds League and Lyran Commonwealth in May, then the Capellan Confederation and Federated Suns in September. In November, House Humphreys agreed to a peace with Liao, which soon spread to all Marik territories, and by December, the Draconis Combine had ceased all but the most minor of actions against its neighbours. The First Succession War had ended. Word of the ceasefire filtered back to the Royal Palace on Tharkad. Upon hearing the news, the Archon let out a long sigh. Thank God. It's over.
Yeah, the music is pretty damn good. Yeah, negative 83 and they weren't even fighting. Wait for it. My God. My God. This was just an hideous. The final count is at the end of the credits. Let's go then. Is the final death count? Yeah, pretty much, Val. Yeah, this was a worthless bloodbath. That's what it was. It was a tidal wave of repressed anger, mostly coming from the Cretans and the Free Worlds League, and that smug bastard Marik. That was a lot of, hold on, we're waiting to see. Because you guys said this, you said the thing. Okay. Is there anything on this? I thought you said the... Guess not. Have I been pranked? I was pranked. Okay. Most of the successful were descended daemonhood. Yeah. This would have been absolutely brutal. This, I guess the best way to say it. No, Box. 1.6 billion death is massive lowball. Like, that's not even lowball. That's one planet, Box. That's one planet. The amount of just utter carnage that happened here. Essentially, what this looks like is that when the Starg League left, the inner sphere was always waiting to go at each other's throats. Always waiting to go into each other's throats. And the second that Kerensky left, it was just a matter of time before things got bad. Things got bad. Oh. At minimum, 90 billion dead. A lot of numbers being tossed around there. So many worlds were simply abandoned. Like over 100 worlds were just simply destroyed by this. Removed from the map because they were just gone. My God. Peace for our time, war pugs. Peace for our time. Speaking of time, it is about that time. I know everybody has to go to work tomorrow. I do too. Yeah, Thanos snapped. Essentially, it's bad to say that the better off militaries lost 60% of their military. The better off militaries lost 60% of their military. That is ugly. That is hideously ugly. Guys, I thought about doing a live stream tomorrow night, but I've kind of decided against it. I want to play some catch up and sit back. Valk, we talked about that earlier today. I want to play some kind of catch up of what I'm doing. But for now, guys, I'm going to head out from here. And next week, we start on the second secession war. If we don't start it this weekend, because I'd love to do something where Sven can show up. This This makes me think more than ever that Battletech is a precursor for 40k because of how utterly barbaric it was. Yeah, stack white for everyone that fought in that war. It was because you look at how much material was lost and how much industrial capacity was lost. The Davians lost all but 25% of their pre-income. Just insane amounts of devastation on a biblical scale. And they just did not stop. Centaurus was that one planet that stopped the Davians from going out. Just going out with a whimper. It stopped that. There's a theory that jump space has warp in. It wouldn't surprise me, Andrew. It really wouldn't. It would not. Guys, I'm going to head out from here. We will continue on with the second successor war. But until then, I will catch you guys next time. I hope you guys are having a good week. I'm so glad I started doing Battletech Tuesday. It has been such a eye-opening thing for me. It has been so much fun learning about this franchise. And see, this is what I talk about. People say, oh, you gotta like one franchise over another. Fuck no. No. I love Battletech for what it has. The same way I love 40k. And people making the comparison for like, oh, which one is stronger? 40k is of course stronger. The population of Ophelia 7 alone outweighs the population of most of the inner sphere itself. Of course 40k is stronger. Doesn't mean that Battletech doesn't have a ton of merit. Doesn't mean that all this stuff that we just found, it's just, those kind of arguments are ridiculous. Guys, Battletech is awesome. I'm loving this. War pugs, have a nice day. Get some good sleep. And I'll catch you guys next time.